Hey guys. Tonight we're climbing aboard for a single night at sea in the age of sail. 8 hours of bells and black water, somewhere between the last light of dusk and the first grey smear of dawn, on a wooden hull that creaks like it's already filed a complaint about the whole arrangement. We're talking about the men who stood watch with nothing but a lantern, a length of rope, and whatever nerve they had left after a 14-hour day. We're talking about a squall that could kill you in about 9 minutes, a captain who might not live to see the sunrise, and one particular night in November of 1718, off the coast of North Carolina, when a pirate crew found out exactly how short a single watch could be. Welcome to the deck of a wooden ship, somewhere on the open Atlantic, 3 centuries ago, where the difference between a dull shift and the worst night of your life was usually a matter of about 20 minutes. Go ahead and dim the lights now. If you've got a fan nearby, turn it on and let it hum low and steady, like wind moving through rigging you can't quite see. That constant drone that never really lets up once it starts. You're warm right now. You're dry, you're still, and you are blessedly unbothered by anything larger than a housefly. That won't be true where we're going. So settle in, let your shoulders go loose, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bell rings twice, and somewhere in the dark above your head, a man you cannot see calls out that all is well. You believe him, mostly because you have no way of checking. It's just past 9 o'clock at night, sometime in the spring of 1718, and you are standing on the deck of a small pirate sloop, somewhere in the shipping lanes between Nassau and the Carolina coast. Under your bare feet, the planking is still warm from the day's sun, a little tacky where old tar has softened and rehardened 100 times over. That warmth is the last comfortable thing that is going to happen to you tonight, so it's worth noticing while it lasts. You signed the ship's articles 4 days ago in a tavern that smelled like spilled rum and wet rope, and somewhere in that fog of celebration nobody mentioned that joining the crew also meant joining the watch bill. Welcome to your first night as a pirate. It turns out that even outlaws keep a schedule. Standing near the mainmast, coiling a line with the unhurried competence of a man who has done this 10,000 times, is Nathaniel Cole, the ship's quartermaster, a Bristol-born sailor in his mid-30s who was, until 7 months ago, a merchant seaman with no particular opinion about piracy one way or the other. He was taken off a Portuguese trading snow along with the rest of her crew, and offered the standard choice: sign the articles and share the risk, or stay locked below until the pirates found a use for him. He signed. Now he's the man responsible for keeping you alive tonight, whether either of you likes it or not, and he has already clocked you as green enough to need watching. First dog watch, he says, without looking up from the line in his hands. You'll get 4 hours tonight, 4 tomorrow, and it'll never be the same 4 twice running. That's the idea. Nobody gets stuck with the graveyard watch every night of their life, not even the captain. You ask him, reasonably, what a dog watch is. He almost smiles. 2 short watches instead of 1 long one. 4 to 6, 6 to 8. Splits the day into an odd number of watches instead of an even one, so the same men aren't standing the same hours every single night. Somebody worked that out a long time before either of us was born, and it's about the only fair thing on this whole ship. He ties off the line and finally looks at you properly. You're on the middle watch tonight. Midnight to 4. Get what sleep you can before then, because you won't get much after. That's the first thing you learn about a night at sea. It isn't one night. It's 4-hour segments, stacked end to end, with your body never entirely sure which portion of the dark it currently owns. The Royal Navy called it watch and watch, half the crew on deck while the other half slept, and pirate crews, for all their reputation as ungovernable rabble, mostly kept the same system, because the sea did not care who was flying which flag. A ship with nobody minding the wheel at 3 a.m. was a ship about to find a reef, a rock, or another vessel the hard way. You go below to grab what rest you can, and this is where the second lesson arrives, considerably less gently than the first. The berth deck smells like bilge water, tar, unwashed men, and something vaguely like a wet dog that has been dead for several days. It is not a smell so much as a physical presence, something you can feel settling onto your skin the moment you duck through the hatch. 40-odd men are crammed into a space with barely 5 feet of headroom, swinging in canvas hammocks slung so close together that your neighbour's elbow is essentially your elbow now. Somewhere close by, someone is snoring with the rhythmic violence of a saw working through green wood. You lie down anyway. Sleep, when you are this tired, does not require comfort. It only requires unconsciousness, and unconsciousness arrives faster than you expect. It does not last nearly long enough. A hand shakes your shoulder sometime later. You have no idea how much later, because there are no clocks down here, only bells, and you are too deep asleep to count them. "Middle watch," a voice says, not unkindly. Up you get. You climb out of the hammock in the dark, banging your shin on a sea chest that was absolutely not there when you went to sleep, or possibly was and you simply didn't notice, and stumble up the companionway into a night so much colder than the evening had been that it feels like walking into a different season entirely. This is the truth nobody tells you about the tropics after dark. The temperature can drop 20 degrees between sunset and midnight, and a body that spent all afternoon sweating through a shirt now finds that same shirt has become a damp, clinging misery. Welcome to the graveyard shift. Nobody has offered you a coffee, because coffee, along with reliable clocks, is still a few decades away from being a normal thing sailors carry. On deck, the world has shrunk to the size of the ship. There is no moon tonight, or not much of one, and the horizon has simply vanished, swallowed into a black that is genuinely difficult for a modern eye to imagine. An eye that has never once in its life experienced true darkness, because there is always, somewhere, a street light or a phone screen or a glowing clock radio holding the void at arm's length. Here there is nothing. No moon, no coastline, no lighthouse, because most of this coast doesn't have one yet. Just the ship, a few lanterns burning low so as not to ruin anyone's night vision, and an ocean that could be 5 feet deep, or 5,000, and you would have no way of telling the difference by looking. Nathaniel finds you at the rail, looking faintly ill. First time seeing dark like this? You admit that it is. Give it a week. Your eyes learn to use what little light there is. Starlight, mostly, if the sky's clear. By your second week aboard, you'll be able to make out the sails without thinking about it. Until then, don't trust your eyes. Trust your ears and your feet. He taps the deck with one boot. This ship talks to you if you let it. Every creak means something. Learn the difference between the ship complaining about nothing and the ship trying to tell you something's wrong, and you'll live a lot longer out here than the men who don't bother. It is, you will come to realize, some of the best advice anyone gives you the entire time you sail under this flag. Your first assignment of the middle watch is the lookout, which sounds almost pleasant until you learn what it actually involves. On a navy ship of the period, lookouts were often posted at the bow or in the tops, and pirate crews, smaller, scrappier, running lighter sloops built for speed rather than firepower, followed the same basic logic out of necessity rather than tradition. Someone has to be the first to see trouble, whether that trouble is a reef, a warship, or a merchant ship worth chasing. Tonight, that someone is you. You climb the ratlines in the dark, feeling for each wooden rung with fingers that have already gone slightly numb, because nobody hands a green recruit a lantern to climb by. A lit lantern aloft would only ruin the very night vision the lookout is up there to use, so you climb blind 30, 40, 50 feet above a deck you can barely see, with a swell rolling the whole mast through an arc wide enough to make your stomach lurch every 10 or 12 seconds. One hand for the ship and one hand for yourself, the old saying goes, except right now both of your hands are extremely occupied with not falling into the Atlantic Ocean. So you're not sure who's minding the ship. At the crosstrees you wedge yourself in as best you can and look out at absolutely nothing. This is the part nobody warns you about. Most of a night watch, even a dramatic pirate one, is staring into featureless dark for 4 straight hours, waiting for something that statistically will not happen tonight. It is boring in a way that is almost dangerous, because boredom at altitude, in the cold, after a 14-hour day, is exactly the condition under which men's attention slips and their grip loosens. A shooting star cuts across the sky to the northeast, gone before you can properly register it, and for one unguarded moment the boredom lifts, and you remember, with something close to wonder, that you are further from land right now than almost anyone you grew up with would ever travel in their entire life. The Atlantic at night, when you stop being afraid of it for a second, is enormous and quiet and strangely beautiful phosphorescent flecks occasionally sparking in the wake below, as if the ship is dragging a trail of tiny cold stars through the water behind it. Nobody in this century has a word for bioluminescent plankton yet. They just call it the sea's fire and leave it at that. You will hear more about that particular light later. Not tonight. 2 bells into the middle watch, you're relieved from the masthead and sent aft to take a turn at the helm, which is a promotion in responsibility, if not exactly in comfort. On a sloop this size, there's no elaborate ship's wheel yet. Many small vessels of the period were still steered by a whipstaff, a vertical lever connected to the tiller below decks, though larger prizes the crew has taken sometimes carry the newer wheel and drum rigging that's slowly becoming standard. Whichever gear this particular ship has, the job is the same. Hold a heading in the dark, using nothing but a compass lit by a single shielded candle in a wooden box called a binnacle, and the feel of the wind on the back of your neck. Your hands, already numb from the ratlines, wrap around cold wood, and Nathaniel stands close by to correct you, because an untrained helmsman can wander a ship 10 degrees off course before anyone notices, and 10 degrees over 4 hours is a genuinely alarming number of miles in the wrong direction. Watch the card, not the sails, he tells you, nodding at the flickering compass. The sails will lie to you. Wind shifts, sails shift, and if you chase the sails you'll be zigzagging across the ocean by sunrise. A hard fact worth holding on to: a well-handled sloop of this era might make 8 or 9 knots in a good wind. Call it roughly 9 or 10 miles an hour, which means every hour you hold a wrong heading by even a small margin compounds into a real and expensive mistake by morning. Your shoulders ache within 20 minutes, your fingers cramp around the wood, and somewhere in the second hour, in the particular misery of cold and tedium, you understand something about pirate life that the taverns back in Nassau conveniently left out of their recruiting pitch. This is largely the same unglamorous seamanship as any merchant cruise, minus the wages and plus the noose, with the promise of sudden riches functioning mostly as a rumour everyone repeats and almost nobody actually collects on. And yet, and this is the part worth sitting with, you chose this. Nobody dragged you down to the dock in chains. On this ship, under these articles, you have a vote in who commands you, and a fixed written share in whatever the ship takes. 2 things a merchant sailor, back on that Portuguese snow, could never claim in his entire career. Cold comfort at 2 a.m, but comfort all the same. Somewhere around 3 a.m, you make the mistake of whistling. An old habit from childhood, entirely unconscious. 3 notes of some half-remembered tune, and Nathaniel's hand closes over your wrist so fast you nearly drop the helm. "Don't," he says. "Not out here, not at night." You ask him why, and he explains, with the patient weariness of a man repeating something he's explained 100 times before, that whistling aboard ship is thought to call up the wind, and while a becalmed crew might beg for exactly that, a crew already carrying a full press of canvas in open water is inviting a gale they very much do not want. It's an old sailor's superstition, older than piracy itself, carried over from merchant crews and naval ships alike, and whatever you personally believe about wind and whistling, the men around you believe it enough that testing the theory at 2 a.m. is a good way to make 40 exhausted, superstitious men extremely nervous about the new recruit. There's a longer list where that came from. No women aboard, though the record shows that rule got broken by at least 2 remarkable women in this very era, whom we'll come to later. No bananas in the hold, blamed, probably unfairly, for a string of ships that vanished around the same period bananas happened to be aboard. No renaming a vessel without a proper ceremony to appease whatever's listening. Not one of these rules has a shred of evidence behind it, and every sailor on this ship, including Nathaniel, follows every one of them without exception, because the ocean has killed enough overconfident men that a little irrational caution starts to look like wisdom. Here's the thing about superstition out here, Nathaniel adds, once your pulse has settled. It's not really about the wind or the whistling. It's about having something to control when almost nothing else out here is controllable. You can't control the weather. You can't control whether that sail up there holds through the next squall. But you can control whether you whistle. So you don't. It's the closest thing to philosophy you'll hear from him all night, and it sticks with you longer than it probably should. 3 weeks out of Nassau, on a different night than this one but cut from the same cloth, the cry comes down from the masthead that changes everything. A sail, fine on the starboard bow, showing no lights. Every man on deck comes instantly, electrically awake. The exhaustion of the middle watch burned off in a single heartbeat. This is the moment the whole crooked economics of piracy hinges on, not the treasure, which is mostly a myth, but the prize. An ordinary merchant vessel loaded with ordinary cargo that can be sold for ordinary money in an extraordinarily illegal way. The captain is summoned from his cabin. The gun crews stir below decks. Someone breaks out the ship's collection of flags, because part of the game, before a single shot is fired, is a bluff, running up false colours to close the distance before the other vessel realises what she's actually looking at. For 20 minutes, the whole ship holds its breath, creeping closer under reduced sail, dark lanterns, dead silence. Then comes the anticlimax that happens far more often in the real historical record than any pitched battle. The sighted ship turns out to be a small coastal trader running empty, or a fisherman blown further offshore than he meant to go, or, as happens tonight, nothing at all, just a low bank of fog catching what little starlight there is and throwing it back at exactly the wrong angle to fool her. Tired lookouts' eyes. The crew stands down, muttering, and the ship returns to the business of simply getting through the night. What actually happens when a real prize is sighted and the bluff works, when grappling hooks fly and men go over the rail in the dark? That's a different story, for a different watch, and we are not there yet. By 4 bells into the middle watch, somewhere close to 2 in the morning, your body starts doing something you have no control over. Your eyelids grow heavy in a way that has nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with biology, and for 3 or 4 seconds at a stretch, you simply are not there. You catch yourself the first time with a jolt of pure fear, because you understand, even half-conscious, exactly what falling asleep on watch could cost you. Ship's articles from this period, the closest thing pirate crews had to law, drawn up and voted on by the men themselves before a voyage began, treated a sleeping watchman as a serious offence, and for good reason. A lookout who dozes off is a lookout who might miss a warship bearing down, a reef dead ahead, or a fire catching below decks. Surviving sets of articles, including ones attributed to captains like George Lowther and Bartholomew Roberts, list punishments ranging from a public flogging with the crew's cat to marooning on some bare stretch of sand with nothing but a pistol, a little powder, and a bottle of water, though it's worth saying plainly that much of what's survived about the exact wording of pirate articles comes down to us filtered through Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account of the era, a book that mixed real depositions and documents with a fair amount of embellishment, so treat any specific punishment quoted from it as according to the record as we have it rather than gospel. Whatever the precise wording on this particular ship, the fear is real enough to keep your spine straight for another 20 minutes. Then it happens again, longer this time, your chin dropping to your chest for what feels like a heartbeat, and turns out, when you jerk awake, to have been considerably longer. A hand lands on your shoulder. Not hard, not the grip of a man about to drag you before the captain. It's Nathaniel, eyes open, he says quietly, close to your ear, glancing once toward the companionway to make sure nobody else is watching this exchange. I didn't see anything. Understand me? You understand him perfectly. What you don't understand, not yet, not on your fourth night aboard, is why a man who owes you nothing would risk his own standing to cover for a green recruit he barely knows. You find out later, from one of the older hands, that Nathaniel was flogged himself as a young sailor on a merchant voyage years before he ever fell in with pirates, caught dozing on a watch not so different from this one, and beaten in front of the entire crew by a captain who saw no particular reason for mercy. He has never once mentioned it to you directly, and never will. He simply decided at some point in the years between that flogging and tonight that he would rather quietly cover for a struggling green hand than watch the same cruelty repeat itself on his own ship under his own watch bill, with him standing by and doing nothing. This is not really a story about kindness in the abstract. A pirate crew is not a village, and it would be dishonest to pretend that everyone aboard cared for everyone else the way a tight-knit town might. Most of these men will part ways within a year, some by choice, some by the gallows, some simply by drifting onto different ships when the articles run their course. What actually bound a crew like this together, day to day, was not sentiment. It was the written articles themselves, the vote that put the captain in his position and could remove him from it just as easily. The roughly equal shares that meant an ordinary hand and an officer weren't separated by the vast gulf of pay that existed on a merchant or naval vessel, and the standing promise, honoured on ship after ship, for which records survive, that a man who lost an eye or an arm or a leg in the taking of a prize would be compensated out of the common stock before the rest of the plunder was divided at all. It's within that hard, practical, transactional structure that a small, unscripted kindness like Nathaniel's stands out all the more, not because the system produced it, but because a person chose it anyway, inside a system that didn't require him to. You don't fall asleep again for the rest of the watch. You don't have to. Something about being covered for, once, by someone who didn't have to do it, keeps you wide awake in a way that fear of the cat o' nine tails never quite managed. Somewhere past 5 bells, the off-duty men not sleeping gather briefly amidships for what passes as the night's one social ritual, a measured tot of rum, watered down into what sailors of every flag called grog, dispensed under the quartermaster's watchful eye, because unwatched rum on a ship full of armed men has historically gone about as badly as you'd expect. Nathaniel keeps a tally in his head. Nobody drinks more than his fair measure, a rule enforced not out of temperance, but out of the same practical logic that governs everything else aboard. A crew that drinks itself insensible is a crew that can't fight, can't sail, and can't survive a storm. For a few minutes, low voices trade news and rumour across the deck in the dark, who took what prize where, who's been seen recruiting in which harbour, which captain's crew supposedly mutinied over a disputed share last month. It is, in its own 3 centuries early way, something very like a group chat, the same appetite for gossip, the same unreliable second-hand information passed hand to hand until nobody remembers who heard it first, just conducted by lantern light instead of a glowing screen. Someone produces a battered fiddle and plays 4 bars of something recognisable before a lookout shouts down for quiet, and the music dies as quickly as it started. Even outlaws, it turns out, have to whisper. In short, this stolen half-hour of rum and rumour is the entire social world of the ship, compressed into its smallest possible form. The closest thing to a tavern that 40 men crammed onto a 100-foot sloop are ever going to get at 2 a.m, 300 miles from the nearest actual one. By 8 bells, your watch finally ends, and the eastern sky has begun its long, unhurried argument with the dark. Not a sunrise yet, just the faintest suggestion that one might eventually be persuaded to happen. Your relief climbs up, rubbing his eyes, and you hand over the helm with hands so stiff you have to consciously unclench them 1 finger at a time. Nathaniel is still there, of course, because the quartermaster's watch never really ends the way an ordinary hand's does. There is always one more thing to check, one more line to inspect, one more green recruit to keep half an eye on until the sun is properly up and the danger of the dark has passed for another day. You go below into a berth deck that smells exactly as bad as it did 4 hours ago, and this time sleep takes you before your head fully settles. Tomorrow, tonight, really, since the watchbill doesn't care what the calendar says, you'll do all of it again. The cold, the boredom, the fear, the small unlooked-for kindness. Somewhere out past the horizon, on other ships flying other flags in other years, other crews are living out entirely different versions of tonight. Some ending in fortune, most ending in nothing much at all, and a few, like the one you're about to hear, ending in a single catastrophic night that the ocean never quite lets go of. That relief, the small, stolen kindness of a night that ended without disaster, is not a guarantee the sea makes to everyone. Some nights end with the watchbill quietly resetting for tomorrow. Others end with a ship torn apart on a sandbar in the dark, and almost everyone aboard drowned before the sun comes up. This next one is that second kind of night. Just after midnight on April 27th, 1717, the sea off the outer arm of Cape Cod has turned into something closer to a war than weather. Waves are breaking over a 110-foot galley slave ship with a violence that snaps her mainmast like a dry branch, and on her deck, in rain driving nearly sideways, men are screaming orders that the wind simply eats before anyone can hear them. Below, in a specially reinforced cabin, sits roughly 4.5 tons of silver and gold, coins from a dozen different nations, melted and reminted plunder from more than 50 captured ships, currently doing nothing whatsoever to keep the vessel afloat, because gold, it turns out, cannot argue with a nor'easter. The ship's captain, a 30-something Englishman the Boston newspapers will later call Black Sam, is somewhere on that pitching deck, and within the hour, he and roughly 144 other men aboard will be dead in water barely 30 feet deep, close enough to shore that some of the bodies will wash up on the beach before the storm has even fully passed. This is the story of the Wider Galley, the slave ship turned pirate flagship that would go on to become, more than 2.5 centuries later, the first authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered from the ocean floor, and the story of the single storm that ended what had briefly been one of the most successful pirate careers of the entire Golden Age. To understand how Samuel Bellamy ended up at the bottom of that reinforced cabin's ledger of gold, you have to go back a few years to a version of the story that gets considerably shakier the further back you push, because much of what's commonly repeated about Bellamy's early life comes down to us through legend rather than any court record or ship's log. According to the popular telling, and it should be stressed that this particular thread is folklore rather than documented fact, young Samuel Bellamy left Devon, England, sometime around 1715, sailed for the Massachusetts colony, and fell in love with a local woman named Maria Hallett on Cape Cod, promising to return from a treasure-hunting voyage a wealthy man and marry her. Whether Maria Hallett existed as anything more than a folk tale invented after the fact to explain why Bellamy's ghost ship supposedly still haunts the Cape Cod coastline is genuinely disputed among historians, and we'll treat it here the way it deserves: a good story, not a documented fact. What is far better documented is what Bellamy actually did once he reached the Caribbean. By 1716, he had fallen in with a Rhode Island goldsmith turned pirate named Palsgrave Williams, and the two of them joined the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding figures of the loose pirate confederation operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas during those years, a period when, by some estimates, more than 1,000 pirates were operating out of that single unpoliced harbour, effectively running their own miniature republic beyond any crown's practical reach. Hornigold had one quirk that would eventually cost him his command: he refused, on principle, to attack English shipping, a scruple his crew increasingly resented as it meant leaving profitable prizes untouched simply because of their flag. Sometime in late 1716, that resentment came to a vote. Pirate crews of this era governed themselves by the same kind of written articles you heard about a few minutes ago, and a captain who lost the confidence of his crew could be removed from command exactly as democratically as he'd been elected to it. Hornigold was voted out. Samuel Bellamy, young, aggressive, and apparently a gifted enough leader to win the confidence of the men who'd sailed under Hornigold, was voted in as captain in his place. He was, by most reasonable estimates, not yet 30 years old. The ship that would make Bellamy's name, and eventually claim his life, was not originally his at all. The wider galley was built in London in 1715, a purpose-built slave ship named for the West African port of Ouidah, in what is now the Republic of Benin, from which she was designed to carry captive human beings across the Atlantic for sale in the Caribbean. On her maiden voyage, having already sold her human cargo in Jamaica and loaded up with sugar, indigo and gold dust bound for England, she was intercepted in the Windward Passage in late February of 1717 by Bellamy's small pirate flotilla. What followed was less a battle than a chase. The Ouidah was fast, but Bellamy's ships were faster, and after roughly 3 days of pursuit, her captain, Lawrence Prince, surrendered rather than risk his crew's lives against a force that clearly had them outgunned. Bellamy did something at this point that tells you a great deal about pirate economics, and rather less about pirate mercy. Rather than simply looting the Ouidah and sending her on her way, he took the ship itself, judging her a considerably better vessel than his own current command. He gave Captain Prince his own former ship, the Sultana, along with a token sum in gold, as something close to fair compensation, and let him sail off unharmed, a transaction that reads almost like a business deal, because in a sense it was one. The Ouidah was then refitted for war, her cargo holds cleared, additional gun ports cut into her hull, and her armament increased to a reported 28 cannon, making her, by the standards of a small pirate fleet, something close to a warship in her own right. Bellamy renamed nothing about her. The Ouidah kept her name even under the black flag, and made her his flagship. Life aboard the newly armed Ouidah, in the 2 months between her capture and her wreck, was by pirate standards unusually flush. Bellamy's fleet, by this point numbering several vessels sailing in loose consort, took prize after prize through the early spring of 1717, and the plunder accumulating in the Ouidah's hold grew into a fortune that later salvagers would spend decades trying to fully account for. An estimated 4.5 tons of silver and gold, much of it minted coin from Spanish, Portuguese, French and English sources, melted and reworked into a single floating treasury. Under the ship's articles, that wealth was not the captain's alone. It belonged in agreed shares to every man who had signed on, from Bellamy himself down to the newest recruit, and the same compensation scale that governed injury on any pirate ship of the era applied here too. A share of that mountain of silver set aside, in principle, for any man who lost a limb taking it. Whether Bellamy was ever genuinely a man of any particular conscience, as some later heavily romanticised accounts like to claim, is difficult to verify against the documented record. What the surviving depositions from captured sailors do describe consistently is a captain who was, by the brutal standards of his profession, relatively restrained, more inclined to talk a merchant crew into surrender and recruit willing volunteers than to torture information out of unwilling ones. It's a far cry from a folk hero, and the record simply doesn't support turning him into one. But it does support the idea that men chose, repeatedly, to join him rather than merely surrender to him, and that distinction mattered enormously to the size and loyalty of his crew. Among the men who chose to join Bellamy's crew was, according to the surviving depositions taken from captured sailors after the wreck, a boy named John King, reportedly somewhere between about 9 and 11 years old, travelling with his mother aboard a captured merchant vessel when Bellamy's men came aboard. The story, as it survives in the colonial record, is a strange and genuinely striking one. Rather than being forced or frightened, young King reportedly insisted, against his mother's tearful objections, on joining the pirate crew of his own will, threatening to kill himself rather than be left behind on his mother's ship. Bellamy's crew, by whatever internal logic governed such things, apparently agreed to take him. If that account is accurate, and it rests on witness testimony rather than physical proof, so it deserves the same according to the record we have caution as anything else pulled from depositions of this period, it would make John King one of the youngest documented pirates of the entire Golden Age. A child choosing, however impulsively, a life and a fate that most adults on that ship never fully escaped either. There is no record of what specific duties a boy his age would have carried out aboard a heavily armed pirate galley, likely something in the range of a powder monkey's work, running gunpowder charges to the cannon crews during action. A job given to boys precisely because their smaller frames could move faster through cramped gun decks than a grown man's. Whatever John King's daily life aboard the Wider actually looked like, it lasted only a matter of weeks. He would still be aboard her on the night that matters most to this story, and what happened to him that night is one of the few genuinely confirmed physical details to survive from the entire wreck, not folklore this time, but forensic evidence, recovered from the ocean floor centuries later. We'll come back to him. By late April of 1717, Bellamy's fleet was sailing north along the American coastline, and on the 26th of that month, somewhere off the coast of what is now Massachusetts, they overtook a small trading sloop called the Marianne, laden with a cargo of Madeira wine bound for New York. Bellamy's men took her as a prize in the ordinary course of business, put a small prize crew aboard to sail her, and continued north in loose company with the Wider and several other vessels of the fleet, a decision that, in hindsight, cost precious hours they did not have. The sky that afternoon had already begun to darken in a way that any experienced sailor on that coast would have recognised as trouble. A nor'easter was building, the particular brand of violent spring storm that has sunk more ships along the New England coastline than almost any other single weather pattern in the region's recorded history. Rather than immediately running for open water or seeking shelter, the fleet pressed on, tracking the coastline north toward Cape Cod as the wind steadily rose through the evening. By nightfall, conditions had deteriorated into what survivors would later describe, in depositions given at trial in Boston, as one of the worst storms anyone aboard had ever experienced. Driving rain, mountainous seas, and a wind that had swung around to blow directly onto a lee shore. The single most dangerous configuration a sailing ship can face. Because it means the very wind driving the vessel forward is also relentlessly pushing her toward the rocks and sandbars she most needs to avoid. The Marianne, with her small prize crew, became separated from the main fleet in the chaos and ran aground on a shoal near what is now Orleans, Massachusetts. Remarkably, her crew survived the night by lashing themselves to whatever solid parts of the wreck remained above water, and were rescued the following morning, several of them later standing trial in Boston, where at least one man successfully argued he had been forced into piracy against his will and was acquitted. The Wider, somewhere out in the worst water beyond her, was not going to be nearly so fortunate. Aboard the Wider herself, sometime after midnight, the storm reached its full and catastrophic strength. Waves estimated by later researchers at over 30 feet were breaking across a hull never designed to survive conditions like this, driving her steadily closer to the outer bar of what is now Wellfleet, on the ocean-facing arm of Cape Cod. At some point in those final hours, the mainmast, a spar likely close to 80 feet tall, carrying the largest single sail on the ship, snapped under the combined strain of wind and wave, an event that would have sounded, according to the handful of second-hand accounts collected afterward, less like a crack of wood and more like a cannon shot, audible even over the howling of the storm itself. With her rigging in ruins and no way to claw off the shore, the Wider struck the outer bar with a violence that broke her back almost immediately. What had been a single 110-foot ship became, within minutes, a scattered debris field, hull planking, rigging, cannon, and roughly 4.5 tons of gold and silver coin, all of it dumped into 30 feet of churning. Freezing water along with somewhere in the neighbourhood of 144 men, most of whom could not swim, a shockingly common gap in seamanship for the period, since the ability to swim was not considered a particularly useful skill by sailors who mostly assumed that falling overboard in open ocean meant death regardless of whether you could paddle for a few extra minutes first. By the time the storm broke toward dawn, bodies had begun washing up along miles of Cape Cod beach, a grim tide that would continue for several days afterward as the ocean slowly gave up what it had taken. Samuel Bellamy's body was reportedly among those recovered, though given the chaos of the scene and the informal nature of colonial-era identification, that detail, like much of this story, carries a note of reasonable uncertainty rather than perfect documentary certainty. Out of roughly 144 men aboard the Wider that night, the documented record credits only 2 with surviving: Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been forcibly pressed into pirate service from an earlier captured vessel, and John Julian, a Mosquito Indian pilot from the Central American coast. Prized by pirate crews of this era for his navigational skill in Caribbean and coastal waters. Both men were pulled from the surf more dead than alive and taken into custody by colonial authorities. Davis, able to demonstrate at trial in Boston that he had been an unwilling conscript rather than a volunteer, was acquitted, a distinction the courts of the period took seriously, since a forced man and a volunteer were understood, even by the men prosecuting piracy cases, to be facing genuinely different degrees of moral responsibility. John Julian's fate afterward is considerably less clear in the surviving record. Some accounts suggest he was later sold into servitude rather than tried as a free man, a reminder that the era's cruelty didn't end at the water's edge, and that a native pilot's treatment under colonial law often diverged sharply from that of the European-born crew around him. Among the bodies that did not survive to stand trial was, by later forensic account, the boy John King. Here is where his story stops being folklore and becomes physical evidence, centuries later, among the wreckage recovered from the ocean floor. Researchers found a single small leather shoe, still containing a human leg bone, matched by size and growth plates to a child of roughly the age King was reported to have been. It is, as close as this story gets to an ending for him, both a genuinely documented artifact and a genuinely heartbreaking one, the only physical trace of a boy who apparently chose this fate for himself rather than staying safely behind with his mother, and who died for that choice in 30 feet of black water off a coastline he'd likely never seen before that final storm. The survivors from the Mary Ann who weren't quick enough or convincing enough to argue forced service did not fare nearly so well as Thomas Davis. That autumn, Massachusetts Governor Samuel Shute presided over a piracy trial in Boston, and in October of 1717, a Puritan minister named Cotton Mather, already one of the most famous clergymen in the colonies, was brought in to deliver what amounted to a spiritual send-off to the men condemned to hang, a sermon later published under the title Instructions to the Living, from the Condition of the Dead, a genuinely documented piece of colonial religious literature that survives in libraries to this day. On November 15, 1717, by the banks of the Charles River, in front of a crowd that colonial accounts describe as enormous by the standards of the small city Boston still was at the time, several of Bellamy's former crew were hanged for piracy, their bodies afterward gibbeted, displayed in iron cages along the harbour, as a deliberate warning to any sailor who might be tempted by the same trade. It is worth sitting with the contrast for a moment. The men who drowned aboard the Wider died in a matter of minutes, in chaos and cold water, with no time to reflect on what was happening to them. The men who survived the Mary Ann's wreck only to be hanged months later had all of that autumn to think about it first. The wreck site itself would go on to have a second, much quieter legal battle more than 2.5 centuries later, once Barry Clifford's team began pulling gold and silver up from the seafloor in the 1980s. Under American salvage law, questions about who actually owns a shipwreck's contents, the state of Massachusetts, the federal government, or the private company that spent years and considerable money locating and excavating the site, are neither simple nor quick to resolve, and Clifford's operation spent years in courts and negotiations securing clear title to what his team had found before a single coin could be legally sold or permanently displayed. It's a strange, almost bureaucratic postscript to a story that began with an actual armed seizure on the open ocean, 300 years after Samuel Bellamy took the Wider from her original captain by force. The question of who rightfully owned what was left of her was settled not with cannon fire, but with paperwork. For 267 years, the Wider lay scattered and buried beneath shifting Cape Cod sand, occasionally rumoured about by local treasure hunters, but never conclusively located. That changed in July of 1984, when an underwater explorer named Barry Clifford, working from old salvage records and colonial-era accounts of the wreck's approximate location, located and began excavating the site roughly 1,500 feet offshore from where the ship had struck. What his team found, and continues to recover to this day, earned the wreck a nickname among marine archaeologists that sounds almost too poetic to be real: the Pirate Pompeii, a site so thoroughly and violently preserved in a single catastrophic moment that it offers a more complete physical record of actual pirate life than any written account from the period, however detailed, ever could. The recovered artefacts, now housed in a dedicated museum, include cannon, navigational instruments, tens of thousands of coins from a remarkable range of nations, and, critically for historians, the ship's bell itself, cast with the words "the wider galley 1716, which allowed researchers to confirm beyond reasonable doubt that this was in fact the ship in question. And not merely a plausible candidate among the countless other wrecks scattered along that same treacherous stretch of coast. It remains, to date, the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered anywhere in the world, which is a strange kind of honour for a night that, for the roughly 142 men who didn't survive it, was simply the worst few hours of their lives. The storm that ended the Wider's brief pirate career was, in its way, only doing what storms along that stretch of coast have always done, before and after that April night, testing the difference between a ship built to survive the open ocean and a ship merely lucky enough, so far, not to have been tested. Below decks on plenty of other ships, that same test was arriving in gentler form, night after ordinary night, as men simply tried to sleep through weather considerably less dramatic than a nor'easter. That's where we're headed next. Not every ship met its end the way the Wider did. For most crews, on most nights, across most of the Golden Age of Piracy, the greatest nightly danger wasn't a nor'easter at all. It was simply getting through the ordinary hours below decks in one piece, which, as you're about to find out, was its own kind of quiet endurance test. You come off watch a little after midnight, ears still ringing faintly from the wind, and climb down into the berth deck of your sloop with the particular full-body exhaustion that 4 hours of concentrated attention leaves behind. The smell hits you before your eyes even adjust to the dark, a thick, close blend of tar, bilge water, unwashed wool, and the specific sourness of 40 men breathing the same recycled air in a space with barely 5 feet of headroom. You've been aboard long enough now that you barely register it anymore, which is either a sign of adaptation or a sign that something in your nose has simply given up. Somewhere nearby, a lantern burns at its lowest possible flame, throwing just enough orange light to keep a man from stepping on his neighbour's face in the dark. Your hammock is exactly where you left it, slung from a hook in the deck beam above, and you fall into it with the boneless relief of someone who has been vertical and alert for far too many consecutive hours. It swings gently with the roll of the ship, a motion that took you nearly 2 weeks to stop finding nauseating, and now, somewhat to your own surprise, actively helps you sleep. Your body has learned to read the sway as safety rather than threat, the same way a baby settles faster when rocked. You are, in this particular moment, about as comfortable as a pirate is ever reasonably going to get. Enjoy it. It will not last the full 4 hours. Something brushes across your bare foot in the dark, small and fast and entirely uninvited, and you understand, with the calm of someone who has already had this exact realization 3 or 4 times this week, that you are sharing your bed with rats. Every wooden sailing ship of this era carried them, in numbers that would horrify a modern passenger, not dozens, but frequently hundreds, breeding in the dark damp spaces between the hull's ribs and the ballast stones at the very bottom of the ship, feeding on stored grain, biscuit, rope fibre, and, when truly desperate, the tallow used to grease the rigging. Ship's logs from the period casually mention rat damage to sail canvas and cargo, the way a modern shipping manifest might mention weather delays, an ordinary expected cost of doing business at sea. Most crews kept at least one ship's cat specifically to manage the problem, and a good ratting cat was valued highly enough that sailors of the period considered harming one seriously bad luck, on top of simply being cruel to a creature doing useful work. Yours is a scarred grey Tom named, without much originality, Cannon, who spends his nights patrolling the hold with a diligence that puts most of the human night watch to shame. Even Cannon, though, can only do so much against a rat population numbering in the hundreds, and there is a particular late-night sound every sailor of this era learns to simply tune out: the scratch and scurry of small claws on wood, somewhere close by in the dark, going about its business with total indifference to yours. You pull the edge of a threadbare blanket up over your exposed foot, more out of habit than any real expectation that it will help, and try to get back to sleep. This too is part of the job nobody mentions in the recruiting tavern. The hammock itself, you've come to appreciate, is one of the small, unglamorous mercies of shipboard life. And it wasn't always standard equipment. European sailors picked up the idea from indigenous Caribbean peoples during the earliest decades of transatlantic contact, adapting a design that local communities had already been using for generations, made from woven cotton netting slung between two fixed points rather than laid flat on a rigid surface. By the time your ship sails, hammocks have become close to universal aboard European vessels, and for good reason. A hammock moves with the roll of the ship instead of fighting it, meaning a sleeping man is far less likely to be thrown bodily onto the deck during rough weather, and the suspended design keeps a sleeper's body up off planking that is, more nights than not, at least a little damp. Later Royal Navy regulations would formally allocate each hammock exactly 14 inches of width per man when the whole crew was hung side by side, a spacing so tight it's genuinely difficult to picture until you've stood in a berth deck and tried to imagine 40 of them slung a few inches apart, swinging in a loose, unsynchronized rhythm like some enormous, slow-motion canvas pendulum clock. Pirate crews, generally smaller, and their ships, generally less crowded than a naval vessel carrying a full complement, had it slightly easier than 14 inches. Though slightly easier on a 100-foot sloop with 40 men, still means considerably less personal space than most modern listeners would tolerate for even a single night, let alone months at a stretch. You've learned to sleep on your side, knees tucked, one arm looped through the hammock's rigging to keep from swinging into your neighbour during a rough patch of sea. It isn't comfortable exactly. But it is, after a 14-hour day and a 4-hour watch, unconsciousness, and unconsciousness is more than enough to ask for tonight. A cough somewhere down the row breaks the rhythm of your half-sleep, wet, deep and persistent, in a way that makes you open your eyes again. It belongs to a young sailor named Robert Teague, 16 or perhaps 17 years old, who signed the articles in Nassau around the same time you did and has spent the last 2 days looking progressively greyer. A shape moves toward him through the dark with the unhurried purpose of someone who has made this same walk many times before. Josiah Pell, the ship's surgeon, a forced man himself, taken off a Bristol slave ship the previous year, specifically because his crew discovered he had some genuine medical training, a rare and valuable skill that pirate crews actively sought out among captured sailors, since a competent surgeon aboard could mean the difference between a lost limb becoming a survivable injury or a fatal one. Pell did not volunteer for this life any more than you did, but the ship's articles guarantee him a larger share than an ordinary hand precisely because of what he knows, and in the strange calculus of pirate economics. That guaranteed share is currently the only thing keeping him from trying to slip away at the next port. He crouches beside Teague's hammock with a small lantern shielded to a thin sliver of light, presses the back of his hand briefly to the boy's forehead, and mutters something too quiet for you to catch. Night rounds like this one were, by necessity, a regular fixture of any longer voyage. Disease, not cannon fire, was overwhelmingly the greater killer of sailors across the entire age of sail, scurvy from the absence of fresh vegetables, dysentery from contaminated water and poor sanitation, and what sailors of the period simply called ship fever, a catch-all term that modern medicine would likely sort into typhus, typhoid, or a handful of other infections thriving in exactly the cramped, poorly ventilated, rat-infested conditions you're currently lying in. Pell has, by his own quiet estimate, buried more men to fever than any pirate crew he sailed with has lost to actual combat, and it shows in the particular weary economy of his movements, a man doing triage in the dark for the 10th time this year. with a supply chest that never quite has enough of what he actually needs. By the third week of the voyage, Teague's fever has become the sort of thing the entire berth deck quietly monitors without ever quite discussing directly. You watch Pell make his rounds each night, checking the same handful of men against a mental ledger only he keeps, this one improving, that one holding steady. This other one he watches a little longer than the rest without saying why. There is no hospital ward on a pirate sloop, no separate sickbay in the modern sense. The sick simply stay in their own hammocks, tended where they lie, because there is nowhere else for them to go. Pell keeps what limited stores he has in a locked chest near the ship's small stern cabin, a modest supply of Peruvian bark, what we'd now recognise as an early source of quinine, though nobody aboard has that word for it yet. A jar or two of vinegar, some opium if the ship has been lucky enough to take a prize carrying it, and a set of surgical instruments that would look, to modern eyes, closer to carpentry tools than medical equipment. Tonight he sits with Teague longer than usual, spooning a thin broth between the boy's cracked lips a few drops at a time, murmuring something low and steady that might be reassurance, or might just be the sound of a tired man talking to keep himself awake through the small hours. Small kindnesses, Pell has been overheard telling a newer hand once, cost nothing and sometimes buy everything. It's not written in any ship's articles. It doesn't need to be. Fever is not the only reason a man might find himself under Pell's lantern in the middle of the night. Combat wounds, when they happen, tend to happen fast and violently, and a serious injury doesn't wait politely for daylight before it needs attention. Amputation, when it came to that, was performed with a set of tools that a modern viewer would recognise with a wince: a bone saw, a tourniquet to slow the bleeding, a heated iron to cauterise the stump afterward, and, if the ship was carrying any at all, a generous dose of rum as the only available anaesthetic. The whole procedure, by most surviving accounts from naval and merchant surgeons of the period, took a skilled hand somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 minutes for the actual cutting, speed itself being a mercy, since a patient conscious and in agonising pain benefited enormously from an operation that ended as quickly as humanly possible. What made pirate crews genuinely unusual, compared to the merchant and naval vessels most of these men had sailed on before turning to piracy, was what happened after the amputation, at least according to the ship's articles that have survived in the historical record. Again filtered largely through Captain Charles Johnson's general history, so treat the specific figures as the tradition claims them, rather than as ironclad fact. Articles attributed to captains including Bartholomew Roberts reportedly specified fixed compensation for injury, paid out of the ship's common plunder before the remaining shares were divided among the rest of the crew, a substantial sum, several hundred pieces of 8 by some accounts, for the loss of a right arm, a slightly smaller sum for a left, and additional sums scaled down through fingers and eyes. A merchant sailor maimed in the same era, injured in the same kind of accident, could generally expect nothing beyond his ordinary wages and whatever charity a captain felt like extending, which was frequently none at all. It's a genuinely striking contrast, and one of the few places where the pirate life, whatever else it cost these men, offered something closer to a safety net than almost any other maritime employer of the era. Somewhere past 2 a.m, the ship groans through a long, low creek that runs the entire length of her hull, and you feel your whole body tense before your brain catches up and identifies it as ordinary, just seasoned oak flexing against the strain of wind and wave. The same complaint the timbers have been making all voyage. Sailors of this era developed an entire private vocabulary of nighttime sound, learning through hard experience which groans meant nothing and which meant everything. A long, resonant creak, evenly spaced, was usually just the hull working normally. A sharp crack, especially one that didn't repeat, could mean a spar under more strain than it could bear. Men who couldn't tell the difference tended not to last as long as men who could. The dark brings its own folklore along with its noises. Sailors of the period spoke, only half joking, of Davy Jones's locker, the ocean floor itself, imagined as the final resting place of drowned men and lost ships. the phrase already old and half mysterious in its origins by the time your crew uses it. Nobody aboard can tell you exactly where the expression came from, only that everyone's grandfather used it too, and that it seems to fit the bottomless black water outside the hull better than any more formal term would. Occasionally, on a very still night, a strange, low, mournful sound will carry through the hull from somewhere out in the dark water. Not wind, not rigging, but something else entirely. A sound sailors of the era had no scientific explanation for, and simply filed away as one more unexplained thing the ocean did. Modern science has since worked out that it was very likely whale song, carrying for extraordinary distances through water, in ways sound simply can't travel through air. But nobody on your ship tonight has that answer, and the mystery honestly suits the hour better than the explanation would. A soft clatter from a few hammocks over turns out to be considerably more mundane than a ghost or a whale. Dice, rolled quietly by two men who ought to know better, stakes apparently a few coins and the losing man's tomorrow morning ration of salt pork. Nathaniel Cole's shadow appears at the edge of the lantern light almost immediately, drawn by the sound the way he seems drawn to every small infraction aboard this ship, day or night. Gambling for money was banned outright under this crew's articles, a rule that shows up, in one form or another, on a striking number of surviving pirate articles from the period, and the reasoning was entirely practical rather than moralistic. A crew crammed together in close quarters for months at a stretch, armed to the teeth, could not afford the resentments and grudges that unpaid gambling debts tend to breed. A disagreement over dice on a merchant ship might end in a shouting match. On a pirate sloop, where every man aboard is carrying at least one loaded pistol, the same disagreement carried genuinely lethal stakes. "Put it away," Nathaniel says, low enough not to wake the rest of the deck, and the dice vanish back into a pocket without argument. There's no dramatic punishment tonight, no flogging, no formal hearing before the whole crew, just a quiet word from the man whose job it is to enforce the articles the crew themselves voted into existence, and an understanding, unspoken, but perfectly clear, that a second offence would not end so gently. It's a small moment, easy to miss if you're half asleep 3 hammocks away, but it's a fairly accurate snapshot of how discipline actually worked aboard most pirate ships most of the time. Not through terror and violence at every turn, as the popular imagination likes to suggest, but through a genuinely functioning, if rough, system of agreed rules, quietly and consistently enforced by men the crew had chosen to enforce them. Near 4 in the morning, you're woken from a shallow doze by a sound you can't immediately place, and then you realise it's Josiah Pell, laughing, quietly and with obvious relief, somewhere down the row of hammocks. You prop yourself up enough to see him with a hand pressed to Robert Teague's forehead, and even in the poor lantern light you can see the boy's eyes are open, properly open, tracking Pell's face with the first real awareness he's shown in 2 days. The fever has broken. Teague's skin, when Pell checks it a second time to be sure he isn't imagining what he wants to see, has gone from the dry, radiating heat of the last 48 hours to something closer to an ordinary. Exhausted sweat, the sign, as reliable as anything in Pell's limited medical toolkit, that whatever infection had hold of the boy has begun, finally, to lose its grip. "Thought I'd lost you," Pell says, quiet enough that it's clearly not meant for the rest of the deck to hear, though you catch it anyway. Teague, still too weak to do much more than mumble, manages something that might be a thank you, and might just be an exhausted attempt at a joke about the broth tasting worse than the fever felt. Pell laughs again, softer this time, and sits with him a while longer than strictly necessary, the way people do when relief hasn't quite finished arriving yet. It would be dishonest to pretend every fever aboard every pirate ship of this era ended the way Teague's does tonight. Plenty didn't, and Pell has buried enough men over the years to know precisely how thin the line is between this outcome and the other one. But tonight, on this ship, in this hammock, the line falls the right way, and for a few minutes in the dark, a surgeon who never asked for this life gets to feel, briefly and completely, like the work was worth doing. One more small ritual happens in these final hours before dawn, easy to overlook but genuinely critical to everyone's survival: the banking of the galley fire. A wooden ship, caulked with tar and rope fibre, rigged with acres of dry canvas and cordage, is in essence a carefully organised pile of extremely flammable material that has been convinced, through considerable engineering effort, to float. Fire was, by a wide margin, the single most feared disaster among sailors of this era, more feared, in the testimony of many surviving accounts, than storms, than combat, than even the prospect of the hangman's noose waiting in port. A blaze that got out of control in open ocean offered almost no good options, no fire brigade to summon, nowhere to run except into the sea itself, and a hold full of gunpowder that turned any serious fire into a race against a far more sudden and total kind of ending. The ship's cook, an older hand who lost most of the hearing in one ear to a cannon some years back, and consequently shouts most of his instructions without quite realising it, makes his own nightly round to bank the galley coals down to the barest possible glow, enough heat to survive until morning without needing to relight the whole fire from scratch, but nowhere near enough to throw a stray spark onto anything nearby. He checks it twice, out of habit rather than doubt, tapping the iron firebox with the flat of his hand to be sure it isn't radiating more warmth than it should. It's a small, unglamorous task, performed in near-total silence at the same hour every night, and it is also, in its quiet way, one of the most consequential jobs on the entire ship. The difference, some nights, between the crew waking up cold in the morning and the crew not waking up at all. By the time your watch bill calls you back up on deck, the eastern sky has started its slow grey argument with the night again, and below decks, for a few hours at least, the ship has settled into something close to peace, Teague sleeping properly now instead of feverishly, Pell finally resting himself in the small stern cabin he's allotted as surgeon, Cannon somewhere in the hold still doggedly patrolling his rat kingdom, the galley coals glowing low and safe under their careful blanket of ash. 40-some men, crammed into a hull barely 100 feet long, held together for one more night by nothing more dramatic than shared discomfort, quiet rules, and a handful of small kindnesses nobody wrote into any article. There is something genuinely remarkable in that, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment instead of rushing past it toward the next dramatic thing. An entire fragile little society, built from forced men and volunteers alike, somehow managing to look after itself through the darkest hours of the night, over and over, ship after ship, for as long as the Golden Age of Piracy lasted. Not every ship's crew managed it, and not every night below deck stayed this quiet. Somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, on a very different night just over a year from now, a far more famous captain than yours would spend his final hours doing something considerably louder than banking a galley fire. Just after sunrise on November 22nd, 1718, in the shallow, tricky waters of Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of North Carolina, a man with slow-burning cannon fuses twisted into his beard is standing on the deck of a small pirate sloop, a cutlass in one hand and a pistol in the other, having just been shot at close range and cut across the neck and still somehow refusing to go down. Around him, a boarding party of Royal Navy sailors is fighting for their lives, in a chaos of smoke, blood, and splintered wood. And the man commanding the other side of this fight, a young lieutenant named Robert Maynard, will later swear under oath that his opponent took 5 separate gunshot wounds and something like 20 sword cuts before he finally fell. A claim that comes down to us through Captain Charles Johnson's general history, and so, like much surrounding this particular pirate, deserves a note of caution about exactly how literally to take the specific numbers, even if the outcome itself is not remotely in dispute. Within minutes, that man's head will be separated from his body and strung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as a trophy and a warning, and the pirate known to history as Blackbeard will be dead at somewhere around his late 30s, ending one of the shortest and most spectacularly successful careers of the entire Golden Age of Piracy, a working criminal record that, remarkably, lasted barely 2 years from his first command to this final morning. This is the story of Edward Teach, the pirate whose reputation for savagery turned out to be, on close inspection of the documented record, almost entirely a costume, a carefully constructed terror built out of smoke, fuses and legend, worn by a man who understood something that has made him famous for 300 years since. That fear, deployed skillfully enough, could win a fight before a single shot was ever fired. The connective tissue between Blackbeard and Samuel Bellamy from a few minutes ago is not accidental. Both men, along with a fair portion of the Golden Age's most famous names, passed at some point through the loose pirate confederation operating out of Nassau under Benjamin Hornigold, the same captain whose refusal to attack English ships eventually cost him his own command. Edward Teach's origins before that point are genuinely murky, and modern researchers digging through English shipping and parish records have increasingly favoured the surname Thackeray over the more famous Teach, suggesting a possible connection to a respectable Bristol or Gloucestershire merchant family rather than the rough, low-born background popular legend prefers to imagine for him. What's better documented is that he served as a privateer, a government-licensed raider, during Queen Anne's war against France and Spain in the early 1700s, gaining exactly the naval and combat experience that would later make him formidable as an outright pirate once that war ended in 1713, and put a great many suddenly unemployed privateers out of legal work at the same time. By 1716, Teach had joined Hornigold's crew as an ordinary sailor, and within a remarkably short span distinguished himself enough to be given command of a captured sloop of his own, an unusually fast rise that suggests either genuine natural leadership, considerable ruthlessness, or, more likely, some working combination of both. When Hornigold was voted out of his command around the same period Bellamy split off to form his own fleet, Teach struck out on an independent course as well, setting the stage for the single most consequential capture of his entire career. In November of 1717, off the coast of Martinique, Teach's small squadron encountered a French slave ship named La Concorde, recently arrived from West Africa and, at the moment of capture, carrying a significantly reduced and weakened crew, since a substantial number of her original sailors had already died of disease during the brutal Atlantic crossing, a grim detail worth pausing on, since it means the ship's own history of cruelty toward the enslaved people in her hold indirectly left her defenceless against the pirates who took her. Teach seized the vessel with minimal resistance, and rather than simply looting her, did exactly what Bellamy had done with the Wider months earlier. He took the ship itself, judging her far superior to his current command. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, fitted her with as many as 40 cannon by some estimates, and turned her into the most heavily armed pirate vessel operating anywhere in the Atlantic world at the time. Around the same period, Teach formed a loose and genuinely strange partnership with a fellow captain named Stead Bonnet, a wealthy former Barbados plantation owner who had, by most surviving accounts, simply grown bored of respectable colonial life and purchased his own pirate sloop outright, an almost unheard of path into the profession compared to the forced men and mutineers who made up most pirate crews. Bonnet, by the consistent testimony of the men who sailed under him, was a poor and inexperienced commander, and Teach, whether out of genuine partnership or simple opportunism, effectively took informal command of Bonnet's ship as well for a time, absorbing an entire second crew's resources and firepower under his own growing reputation. It's a partnership historians still debate the exact nature of, somewhere between alliance and quiet takeover, and the surviving record doesn't settle the question definitively either way. Teach's reputation reached its high water mark in May of 1718 when he sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge alongside several other vessels under his loose command, directly into the harbour entrance of Charleston, South Carolina, and blockaded the entire port for roughly a week, an audacious act that effectively held one of the wealthiest colonial cities in North America hostage. He captured several ships attempting to enter or leave the harbour, took a number of prominent Charleston residents captive aboard his flagship, including, according to the colonial record, a councilman named Samuel Wragg, and sent a demand ashore that strikes modern ears as almost comically specific for a man with such a fearsome reputation. Not gold, not a ransom in coin, but a chest of medical supplies, urgently needed given that a fair portion of his own crew was apparently suffering from some kind of illness, possibly a venereal infection contracted in earlier ports, that his surgeon lacked the means to treat. Charleston's authorities, faced with an armed blockade and captive citizens, complied, sending out a chest of medicine worth a reported £300 to £400 sterling, and Teach, true to his side of the arrangement, released his hostages unharmed once the exchange was complete. It's a genuinely revealing episode, for a man whose legend would eventually paint him as an almost supernatural figure of pure random violence. The actual documented record of the Charleston blockade shows something closer to a calculating transactional operator who understood exactly how to leverage fear into a specific practical outcome, and who, as far as the surviving record shows, killed nobody at all in the process of pulling it off. That gap between the documented Teach and the legendary Blackbeard is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the costume he built for himself was, by any measure, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. According to Johnson's General History, again, a source to treat as tradition rather than verified fact in its specifics. Though this particular image has become so central to the character that it's worth examining regardless, Teach grew his black beard long enough to braid, tied the braids off with coloured ribbons, and before battle would twist slow-burning hemp cord, the same slow match used to fire cannon, into the hair beneath his hat, so that in the smoke and confusion of a fight he appeared to be wreathed in his own personal cloud of drifting smoke, his face lit from below by tiny orange embers. He reportedly wore a bandolier across his chest, carrying several pistols and knives simultaneously, a walking arsenal designed to be seen from a considerable distance, and cultivated a general air of barely restrained menace calculated to make an approaching merchant crew surrender the moment they got a good look at him, rather than risk finding out what he was actually capable of. Here's the thing worth sitting with. As far as the documented historical record shows, Edward Teach is not confirmed to have personally killed anyone before that final morning at Ocracoke. Not one specific victim's name survives attached to his own hand, across roughly 2 years of a piracy career built almost entirely on reputation, rather than demonstrated body count. The beard, the fuses, the pistols, the deliberate silence, all of it was functionally an extremely effective bluff, dressed up as inevitability. Most of his prizes surrendered the instant they recognised him, which meant Teach rarely had to actually fight for what he took. It is, in its strange way, one of history's most successful applications of reputation management, executed roughly 280 years before anyone coined that particular corporate phrase. That reputation began to unravel, ironically, at the moment of Teach's greatest apparent success. In June of 1718, shortly after the Charleston blockade, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground and broke apart on a sandbar near Topsail Inlet, close to present-day Beaufort, North Carolina. The official explanation at the time was simple misfortune, but a good number of historians since have raised a considerably more calculating theory that Teach deliberately grounded his own flagship, along with a second smaller sloop, specifically to strand and abandon a large portion of his crew. As many as several hundred men had been sailing under his loose command by this point, far more than he could realistically continue to pay or trust, leaving him with a smaller, more manageable, and more loyal corps to split a now undiluted share of plunder among. Whether that reading is accurate or simply an appealingly cynical story that's grown up around the wreck, the practical result is not in dispute. Teach walked away from the grounding with roughly 40 of his most trusted men aboard a single remaining sloop, and left the rest of his former crew stranded on the North Carolina coast to fend for themselves. Not long after, in June of 1718, Teach did something that seems almost anticlimactic given everything that came before it. He sailed into Bath, North Carolina, and formally accepted the King's pardon, a general amnesty Britain's government had extended to pirates willing to abandon the trade, offered under Governor Charles Eden's authority in the colony. For a brief period that summer and autumn, Edward Teach lived something close to an ordinary colonial life near Bath, according to several accounts, marrying a young local woman, reportedly his 14th wife by some tellings, and maintaining what looked, at least on the surface, like a peaceable retirement. Retirement did not entirely take. Through the autumn of 1718, Teach continued making short voyages out of North Carolina's inlets, and colonial authorities in neighbouring Virginia grew increasingly convinced, based on captured witness testimony and captured cargo, that he was resuming piracy under the convenient cover of his pardon, with Governor Charles Eden either turning a genuinely negligent blind eye or, as some of the surviving correspondence and later court proceedings strongly suggest, actively profiting from a quiet arrangement with the man he was supposed to be keeping in check. Virginia's own governor, Alexander Spotswood, lacked any legal jurisdiction to act against a pirate operating in North Carolina waters, but he had something arguably more useful: money, ships, and a personal determination to see Teach dealt with regardless of the jurisdictional technicalities standing in his way. Spotswood arranged, at his own expense, to hire 2 small sloops and crew them with Royal Navy sailors drawn from warships already stationed in Virginia waters, placing the expedition under the command of a lieutenant named Robert Menard. An experienced naval officer given a task that was, functionally, a deniable, privately funded raid into another colony's territory in pursuit of a man who technically held a valid royal pardon. It was, by the legal standards of the day, a genuinely questionable operation. Spotswood judged, correctly as it turned out, that a dead pirate would generate considerably less political trouble than a living, ongoing embarrassment, continuing to operate a few miles south of his own colony's border. On the afternoon of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, arrived off Ocracoke Inlet, where Teach's sloop Adventure lay at anchor with what turned out to be a badly depleted crew. Many of his men were ashore or away on other business that day, leaving him with somewhere around 18 to 25 hands aboard against Maynard's considerably larger combined force, though the exact numbers on both sides vary somewhat depending on which surviving account you trust. Both commanders, in the hours before the actual fighting began, resorted to essentially the same tactic: deception through concealment. Maynard kept the bulk of his sailors hidden below deck as his sloops approached through the shallow, treacherous inlet waters, presenting a deliberately undermanned appearance to draw Teach into a closer, more confident engagement. Teach, for his part, is said to have done something similar, keeping part of his own reduced crew out of sight to disguise just how thin his numbers actually were that morning. The 2 sides exchanged fire as Maynard's sloops closed the distance, and at least one of Maynard's vessels ran briefly aground in the inlet's notoriously shallow channels, a hazard local Ocracoke pilots understood far better than any visiting Royal Navy officer could. As the range closed to nearly point blank, Teach's crew loosed a devastating close-range broadside packed with scrap iron and shot that killed or wounded a substantial portion of the sailors aboard Maynard's lead sloop in a single volley. By some accounts, more than 20 men were killed or wounded outright in that one exchange. A catastrophic toll that, for a brief and genuinely uncertain moment, must have made the coming fight look like it was about to go entirely Teach's way. One persistent piece of Blackbeard folklore deserves a direct word before the story reaches its final morning, since it's arguably the single most repeated myth attached to his name, the idea that he buried a vast fortune somewhere along the Carolina coast, a treasure still waiting, in countless modern legends, for some lucky beachcomber to dig up. There is, in the entire surviving historical and archaeological record, no credible evidence that Teach, or, for that matter, almost any pirate of the Golden Age, actually buried treasure in any organised way. The economics simply didn't support it. Plunder needed to be converted into usable coin or goods relatively quickly to pay a crew who had signed on precisely because they expected their agreed shares in a reasonable time frame, not because they trusted a captain to remember a map years later. Most pirate wealth, by every reliable account of the period, was spent almost immediately in port taverns and brothels, rather than carefully hidden for a future that most pirates, given the short average career and shorter average lifespan of the profession, had no realistic reason to plan for. The one possible exception in Teach's own case involves a documented but modest sum, reportedly around gold worth roughly a few £1,000s sterling. That some later legal proceedings against his associates suggest he may have entrusted to Tobias Knight for safekeeping, a far cry from the sprawling treasure map fantasy that would eventually attach itself to his name, but a detail interesting enough, and grounded enough in actual court testimony to be worth mentioning honestly rather than dismissing outright. Believing he had effectively won the engagement, Teach led a small boarding party across onto what he thought was a nearly emptied enemy sloop and walked directly into the trap Maynard had set. At the lieutenant's signal, the sailors he'd kept concealed below deck surged up onto the deck in a sudden rush, and what followed was several minutes of brutal, close-quarters hand-to-hand fighting. Cutlass against cutlass, pistol against pistol, in a confined space with nowhere for either side to retreat. Maynard and Teach reportedly exchanged pistol shots directly at one another early in the melee, with Teach taking a wound but continuing to fight, and the two men eventually came together in single combat with swords, their blades reportedly snapping at some point in the exchange, forcing both commanders to continue the fight with whatever weapons came to hand next. It was in this final chaotic scramble that Teach sustained the wounds that finally brought him down, by Maynard's own later account, and again filtered through Johnson's retelling rather than an independent naval report, something in the range of 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts, sustained over what must have been only a matter of minutes, before he finally collapsed on the deck of a ship that was not even his own. It's worth pausing on the sheer physical improbability of that number. A man absorbing that much damage and continuing to fight through most of it, whether the specific count is precisely accurate or somewhat inflated in the retelling. The underlying testimony from multiple surviving crew members on both sides agrees on the essential shape of it. Edward Teach did not go down easily, and did not go down early. With Teach finally down and the remaining pirates aboard either killed, wounded or surrendering, Maynard ordered his men to cut off Teach's head and hang it from the bowsprit of his sloop, a grim but calculated piece of theatre, intended to serve as unambiguous proof, to both his own superiors and to any other pirate crew who might spot the returning ships, that Blackbeard was genuinely, finally, dead. His body, according to the popular legend that grew up almost immediately afterward, was thrown overboard and reportedly swam several full circles around the ship before finally sinking. A detail that belongs firmly in the category of folklore rather than fact, a piece of instant mythology attached to a man whose entire career had already blurred the line between documented reality and deliberately cultivated legend, and it seems fitting in a dark way that even his death couldn't entirely escape that same blurring. Maynard sailed the grim trophy north to Virginia, where the head was displayed on a pole at the mouth of the Hampton River, a location still informally remembered locally today as Teacher's Point, serving exactly the same psychological function in death that Teacher's smoking beard had served in life, a visible, unmistakable warning to anyone who might be tempted toward the same trade. Colonial authorities in Virginia also moved against the North Carolina officials suspected of protecting Teach, and a local official named Tobias Knight, closely tied to Governor Eden, was formally investigated for corruption and complicity, though he died before the matter could be fully resolved through the courts. What's genuinely remarkable, looking back across the whole arc of Edward Teach's short career, is how thoroughly the legend outran the man. A pirate who is not confirmed to have personally killed anyone before the very last morning of his life became, within a generation, a byword for indiscriminate, almost supernatural violence, his fictionalized cruelty exaggerated further with every retelling, every stage play, every children's costume, until the historical Teach became almost impossible to locate underneath 3 centuries of accumulated invention. And yet the strategy that made him famous in the first place, the beard, the fuses, the studied menace, the near-total absence of actual bloodshed required to make merchant crews surrender on sight, was never really about violence at all. It was about the story violence tells before it even happens, and Edward Teach appears to have understood that particular trick better than almost anyone else of his era. There is something worth sitting with in that, the most feared pirate in Atlantic history built his entire reputation less on what he did than on what he successfully convinced people he might do, and it worked so well that he barely had to prove it right. He died, in the end, not because his fearsome legend failed him, but because a determined lieutenant with a hidden crew and a specific grudge simply refused to be frightened off by it. Not every dangerous night at sea, though, comes from another ship at all. Sometimes the enemy is simply the ocean itself, and there's no boarding party, no bluff, no beard full of burning fuses that can talk a storm out of doing exactly what it intends to do. The air changes first. That's the thing nobody quite manages to explain to you beforehand, and the thing you notice before anything else does. You're 2 hours into your watch, sometime past 10 at night, and the humid stillness that's hung over the ship all evening suddenly develops a faint metallic edge to it. A smell you can't quite place, but that every experienced hand around you seems to recognize instantly. The way a dog recognizes a stranger's footstep before anyone else in the house hears the door. The swell, which has been a gentle, almost lulling 3 or 4 feet all evening, begins arriving in longer, deeper sets, rolling the ship through a wider arc than it's managed all voyage. Overhead, the stars that gave you just enough light to make out the rigging an hour ago have started disappearing, not gradually, but in a spreading blot moving in from the southwest, swallowing the sky section by section like something eating its way toward you. Nathaniel Cole is at your side almost before you've fully registered any of it, his usual unhurried competence replaced with something sharper. "Go rouse the captain," he says, already moving toward the mainmast himself. "Tell him the glass is dropping. Your ship, unlike most pirate sloops of this era, carries one genuine luxury, a small mercury barometer, taken as plunder from a wealthy merchant vessel some months back, kept in the captain's cabin and consulted rarely, because for most of the voyage it has had nothing useful to say. Tonight it apparently has quite a lot to say, and none of it good." Within minutes the captain is on deck in his shirt sleeves, and whatever quiet you'd been enjoying up to this point evaporates entirely, replaced by the particular controlled urgency of 40 men who have all, at some point in their careers, learned exactly what happens to a ship that gets caught with too much sail up when a real blow arrives. All hands on deck. The cry passes down the companionway and below decks, and within what feels like seconds, sleepy, half-dressed men are pouring up onto a deck that's already beginning to pitch harder than it was 10 minutes ago. There's no panic in it, or not yet. This is drilled, practiced motion. The same sequence of actions this crew has rehearsed enough times that muscle memory can carry them through even a genuine crisis, without anyone needing to think too hard about what comes next. But drilled motion and calm nerves are two very different things. And you can read the second one slipping away from more than a few faces around you as the wind, still gentle for the moment, gives the first hint of the teeth it's about to show. Topsails first. The captain shouts over a wind that's audibly rising even as he speaks. Reef the main. Vance, Cole, aloft with a new hand, show him what to do, because he's about to learn fast whether he likes it or not. That new hand is you. Within the hour, you're back up in the rigging, except this time, the calm, boring darkness of your very first night watch has been replaced by something considerably more alive. Wind now gusting hard enough to physically push you sideways against the rat lines. Rain arriving in stinging, near horizontal sheets, and a mast swinging through an arc wide enough that holding on with both hands no longer feels optional so much as a basic condition of continuing to exist. Beside you, struggling with a section of sodden canvas that seems to actively resent being folded, is Peter Vance, a forced man taken off a captured Bermuda sloop only 6 weeks ago, who has made no secret of the fact that he intends to slip away and return to an honest trade the moment any halfway plausible opportunity presents itself. Tonight is not that opportunity. Tonight, whatever Vance's long-term intentions, his hands are needed exactly as badly as everyone else's. Reefing a sail, reducing its exposed area by tying off a section along a row of short lines called reef points, is dangerous, physically brutal work even in calm weather. and in a rising gale it becomes something closer to a fight, canvas that weighs, when soaked through, considerably more than it looks like it should, whipping and cracking with enough force to break fingers that get caught wrong. All of it happening 50 or 60 feet above a deck that itself is pitching through an arc violent enough to make the mast feel like the most dangerous place on the entire ship rather than any kind of refuge from it. Vance's hands are shaking, and not entirely from cold. First real blow? You shout to him over the wind, more to steady your own nerves than out of genuine curiosity about his. He nods, jaw clenched, and keeps working anyway. Which is really the entire unglamorous substance of courage at sea. Not the absence of fear, but doing the knot correctly with your hands shaking regardless. By the time you're back down on deck, soaked through and shaking with cold and adrenaline in roughly equal measure, the second job has already been assigned to you, and a rotating handful of other men. The pumps. Every wooden ship of this era took on water constantly, even in calm weather, simply through the ordinary flexing and working of her hull planking against the caulking meant to seal it. And a storm like this one accelerates that seepage dramatically, as the hull twists and strains against wave after wave, hitting her at odd, punishing angles. The pumps themselves are simple mechanical devices, worked by hand in relentless, repetitive strokes, forcing bilge water up and out through a discharge pipe over the side, and the job carries no glory whatsoever, no dramatic flourish, just the flat. Grinding physical labour of moving your arms in the same motion, hour after hour, while everything around you pitches and howls. Half hour on, half hour off, Nathaniel tells you, appearing briefly through the rain to check the crew rotation, water streaming off a face that looks, for the first time since you've known him, genuinely tired rather than merely competent. Ship doesn't sink from one big wave usually, sinks from nobody minding the little leaks while everyone's busy being frightened of the big ones. It's another piece of the same quiet philosophy he offered you weeks ago about superstition and control. The storm itself is entirely outside anyone's power to influence. But the pumps are not, and so the pumps get worked, methodically, by exhausted men, for exactly as long as the storm demands it of them. Somewhere near the height of the storm, lightning splits the sky close enough that the thunder arrives almost simultaneously with the flash. A single deafening crack that makes every man on deck flinch in unison, and for one genuinely terrifying second, your mind goes straight to the powder magazine, the sealed, carefully guarded compartment below decks where the ship's entire supply of gunpowder is stored. A single spark away from turning the whole vessel into a fireball rather than a shipwreck. Lightning striking a wooden mast was a real and documented hazard of the age of sail, capable of splintering timber, killing or maiming men caught near the strike point, and in the worst documented cases, igniting exactly the kind of catastrophic magazine explosion every sailor aboard is thinking about right now without anyone needing to say it out loud. There is, at this point in history, no lightning rod system reliably protecting a ship like yours. That particular innovation is still decades away from becoming standard equipment. Which means the mast towering above you right now is, structurally speaking, simply the tallest and most conductive object for a considerable distance in any direction. A strange blue-white glow flickers briefly at the very tip of the mainmast, faint and eerie against the black sky, gone again almost before you can be sure you saw it. A few of the older hands mutter something under their breath and touch whatever small charm or token they keep for exactly this purpose, what that particular light actually is, and what generations of sailors before you have believed about it, is its own story, and a stranger one than you'd expect, but this is not the night to tell it. Right now there's only the storm, the mast, and the collective unspoken hope that lightning finds somewhere else to land tonight. Fear, when it has nowhere useful to go, tends to look for somewhere to land anyway, and on a night like this one, that somewhere is frequently a person rather than an explanation. You overhear it rather than witness it directly, a low half-shouted exchange near the foremast between two older hands, arguing over whether a recently signed crewman, a quiet man who joined only 2 ports back, and has said barely a dozen words to anyone since, might be what sailors of this era called a Jonah, an unlucky presence aboard, carrying some invisible curse capable of drawing storms and misfortune down onto an entire ship simply by being present on it. The term traces back to the biblical prophet thrown overboard by his own shipmates to calm a storm they blamed him for causing, and by the 18th century it had long since become a general-purpose maritime superstition, applied to almost anyone unlucky enough to be aboard when things started going badly. A new hand, a passenger, occasionally even a specific unlucky item or colour. Nathaniel shuts the conversation down the moment he catches wind of it, with considerably less patience than he showed you over the whistling a few weeks back. Storm doesn't care who's aboard, he snaps, loud enough to be heard by the handful of men nearby. Man the pumps or get out of the way. Nobody argues with him, though you notice the quiet crewman in question keeps unusually close to Nathaniel's side for the rest of the night, whether for actual protection or simple proximity to the one man clearly not interested in blaming him for the weather. It's a small, ugly undercurrent in an otherwise unified crew, and it resolves itself quietly enough, but it's worth remembering later how easily fear on a night like this one can curdle into something considerably less generous than the courage and lifelines you're about to see a few minutes from now. It's during the worst of the wave action, sometime past what would be midnight if anyone still had a reliable way of telling time in this chaos, that the storm delivers its closest brush with real tragedy. A wave breaks hard over the starboard rail, considerably larger than the ones that have come before it, and you hear Peter Vance's shout cut off mid-word as the wall of water sweeps across the deck and takes him with it, his boots skidding out from under him on planking that offers no purchase at all against that much moving weight. For one horrible suspended second, there's nothing between him and the black water beyond the rail except momentum and luck, and neither of those seems to be working in his favour. What saves him is the lifeline, a length of rope rigged fore and aft along the deck specifically for nights exactly like this one, that every hand aboard has been ordered to clip onto before the storm's full force arrived. Vance's line goes taut with a violence that must have half dislocated his shoulder, but it holds, and he's left dangling half over the rail, one hand clawing for anything solid, until Nathaniel and another sailor reach him and haul him back aboard, soaked, bleeding from a gash across his forehead where he struck something on the way down, and shaking in a way that has nothing left to do with cold. Nobody makes a joke about it. Nobody has the breath to spare for one. Nathaniel simply checks the wound with 2 fingers, decides it isn't urgent enough to pull Vance off the pump rotation, and shoves him back toward his station with something that might, in gentler circumstances, have qualified as a reassuring pat on the back. It is, in its terrifying unglamorous way, the entire storm compressed into a single moment. A rule nobody particularly wanted to follow. Clip on your line, every time, no exceptions turning out, on exactly the one night it mattered, to be the difference between Peter Vance surviving this voyage and becoming one more name nobody wrote down. Through all of this, the captain has barely left the helm, lashed loosely to a stanchion near the wheel with a short length of rope so that a rogue wave can't simply take him the way it nearly took Vance, calling out headings and sail orders in a voice gone hoarse from shouting over hours of wind. This is, in its own way, the truest test of the entire system of governance this crew voted into place back in some quiet Nassau tavern months ago. A captain aboard a pirate ship holds his position only as long as the crew's confidence in him lasts. And there is no better proving ground for that confidence than a night like this one, when every decision he makes, hold this heading, reduce that sail. Ride out this next wave rather than try to outrun it, carries the weight of every life still working the pumps and clinging to the rigging below him. A captain who freezes, who guesses wrong at the wrong moment, who loses his nerve in front of a frightened crew, doesn't merely risk the ship. He risks the vote that put him there in the first place, assuming there's a later left in which that vote can even happen. Tonight, whatever else can be said about him, this captain does not freeze. He reads the wave sets, adjusts the heading a few careful degrees to take the worst of the swell at a slightly better angle, and holds that course with a stubborn, exhausted steadiness that slowly, gradually. It begins to feel less like desperate improvisation and more like actual command. You watch him from your position at the pumps, and for the first time since you signed the articles, you understand something about why this particular crew chose this particular man to lead them. Not because he promised riches, which every captain promises, but because, on a night that genuinely mattered, he appears to know exactly what he's doing. The storm's true peak arrives without much warning, a single enormous wave that seems, in the brief flash of lightning that illuminates it, genuinely taller than the mast itself. An optical trick of adrenaline and darkness more than an accurate measurement, almost certainly, but it doesn't feel that way in the 2 or 3 seconds you have to watch it come. The ship rides up its face at an angle steep enough that you find yourself gripping the pump handle less for leverage than simply to keep from sliding backward across the deck, and then, at the crest, she seems to hang suspended for one impossible weightless instant before dropping into the trough beyond, with an impact that you feel travel up through the soles of your feet and into your teeth. Something forward gives way with a crack loud enough to be heard even over the wind, a section of the ship's small boat, lashed on deck for exactly this kind of emergency, has torn loose from its securing lines and is now sliding dangerously across the planking. A several £100 hazard that could crush a man's leg, or worse, if it catches him at the wrong moment. 2 hands throw themselves at it, wrestling it back under control and resecuring the lines with fingers gone half numb from cold and effort, working fast and wordlessly in the particular efficient silence that real emergencies tend to produce once the initial shock of them has passed. The hull groans, deep and long, under a strain that would genuinely alarm you if you had the spare attention to devote to being alarmed by it. But she holds. Whatever else this storm takes from you tonight, sleep, warmth, a fair amount of skin off your palms, it does not, in the end, take the ship itself. Gradually, in the way storms at sea tend to end, not with a sudden switch flipping from violence to calm, but through a long, grudging easing that you almost don't trust at first, the wind begins to drop. The rain thins from sheets to a steady, ordinary downpour, and then to something you could almost call drizzle, if drizzle were capable of soaking through 4 layers of already sodden wool. The wave sets lengthen back out, the terrifying steep chop of the storm's peak gradually relaxing into something closer to the long, rolling swell you'd grown almost fond of before any of this started. Nobody cheers, exactly. Everyone aboard is simply too exhausted for anything as energetic as celebration, but you can feel something loosen collectively across the deck. 40 men's shoulders dropping half an inch in near unison as the immediate threat of drowning recedes into merely the ordinary, familiar threat of everything else about this life. Peter Vance finds you near the pumps once the rotation finally, mercifully stands down, his forehead crudely bandaged, his hands still not entirely steady. "Oh, you," he says, "though you're fairly sure you did nothing beyond standing nearby when it mattered, and the credit properly belongs to a length of rope and whatever engineer first thought to rig a lifeline in the first place." You don't correct him. Some debts, even inaccurate ones, are worth letting a frightened man pay off in his own head if it helps him sleep. Nathaniel passes behind you both, wringing water from his sleeve, and says nothing at all. Just a brief hand on each of your shoulders in turn, the closest thing to praise this particular quartermaster hands out, and worth considerably more for its rarity. Dawn arrives grey and unremarkable, as if the sky itself is a little embarrassed about the previous night's behaviour, and in its flat. For giving light, you finally get a proper look at the damage, a length of torn rigging here, a splintered rail there. The small boat you helped save now sitting slightly crooked in its chocks, but fundamentally intact, and 40 exhausted men moving around the deck with the particular slow, careful gait of people whose bodies have simply run out of adrenaline to run on. Nobody was lost, given the size of the wave that nearly took Peter Vance, given the lightning that found somewhere else to strike, given 4.5 hours of a storm that could easily have ended very differently. That outcome feels less like the ordinary result of competent seamanship, and more like something worth genuine wonder. The particular, humbling astonishment of realizing exactly how much smaller and more fragile your ship actually was than it felt 4 hours ago, in the calm before any of this began. You think, standing at the rail and watching the sun finally break weakly through the retreating clouds, about that strange blue-white light you glimpsed at the masthead in the worst of it, gone again before you could be sure it had been real at all. You're not the only one who's ever wondered about a light like that on a night like this one. Sailors have been seeing it, fearing it, and building entire ghost stories around it for centuries before you were ever born. And what they made of it, and what it actually is, turns out to be a considerably stranger tale than the storm you just survived. In 1520, somewhere off the tip of South America, a young Italian scholar named Antonio Pigafetta was keeping a journal aboard one of the ships of Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, a fleet fighting its way through a violent storm in unfamiliar freezing waters near what would later be named the Strait of Magellan. In the depths of that storm, according to Pigafetta's own surviving account, a strange light appeared at the tips of the ship's masts, a soft, flickering glow that seemed to burn without consuming anything, hovering there for as long as an hour, before quietly vanishing. Rather than terrifying the crew, the light seemed to calm them almost instantly. They took it, in Pigafetta's own words, as a sign that they were under the protection of a familiar patron saint, and the storm's violence, whether by coincidence or genuine meteorological correlation, began to ease not long afterward. That light had a name centuries before Pigafetta ever saw it, and it would go on having names, fears, and explanations attached to it for centuries more, across nearly every seafaring culture that ever sailed a wooden ship into a genuinely electric sky. This is the story of Corposant, the ghost light that calmed sailors' nerves for 2,000 years before science finally, quietly explained it away, and the broader tradition of phantom lights and phantom ships that grew up in its shadow, right through the Golden Age of Piracy and long past it. The phenomenon Pigafetta described is old enough that the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder was already writing about it more than 1,400 years earlier, in the 1st century of the Common Era, under a name borrowed from mythology. He called the lights Castor and Pollux, after the divine twin brothers of Roman legend, and made a genuinely interesting distinction that would echo through maritime folklore for the following 2,000 years. A single light appearing alone was considered an ill omen, portending a worsening of the storm, while two lights appearing together were taken as a sign of safety and imminent calm, mirroring the mythical twins who were said to protect sailors specifically when they appeared as a pair. By the medieval and early modern period, European sailors, and Catholic sailors especially, had attached a new name to the same phenomenon, St. Elmo's fire, after St. Erasmus of Formia, an early Christian bishop and martyr who became, somewhat obscurely, the patron saint of sailors, the specific chain of reasoning connecting a 3rd century Italian bishop to 4th century electrical. Phenomena at sea being, like a great deal of medieval hagiography, more a matter of accumulated tradition than clear documented logic. Mediterranean and Iberian sailors more commonly used a related term, corpo santo, meaning holy body, a phrase that survives in the English maritime vocabulary today as corposant, the word still used by sailors and meteorologists alike to describe exactly the light Pigafetta watched flicker on Magellan's masts 500 years ago. What sailors of the Golden Age of Piracy were actually watching, without any framework to properly explain it, is a phenomenon modern physics calls a corona discharge. During a thunderstorm, or in the charged, unsettled atmosphere that precedes and follows one, the electrical field surrounding a ship can build to an intensity strong enough to ionize the air immediately around any sufficiently pointed conductive object. A mast tip, a yardarm end, occasionally even the raised tips of a man's own hair or fingers in the most extreme conditions. That ionized air glows, typically in a blue or violet hue, producing a soft, hissing, almost flame-like light that burns cold, consumes nothing, and can flicker and dance along a spar for anywhere from a few seconds to, in Pigafetta's account, the better part of an hour. It would take until the middle of the 18th century, well after the Golden Age of Piracy had run its course, for genuine scientific understanding to catch up with centuries of sailors' folklore. The American statesman and scientist Benjamin Franklin, through his own famous experiments connecting lightning to electricity in the early 1750s, helped lay the groundwork that eventually let scientists explain corposant not as a saint's blessing or a mythological twin, but as a predictable, measurable electrical event, entirely explicable and, once properly understood, no longer especially mysterious at all. But no pirate crew sailing under Blackbeard or Bellamy or 100 less famous captains had access to that explanation. To them, the light at the masthead was exactly what centuries of tradition told them it was: an omen. Benevolent or threatening depending on how many lights appeared and which sailor you happened to ask, and worth crossing yourself over, touching a lucky charm, or simply falling silent in front of, the same way sailors on Nathaniel Cole's ship, watching a similar flicker at their own masthead a few minutes ago in this story, chose not to discuss it further in the middle of their own storm. The light at the masthead was only ever one small piece of a much larger tapestry of maritime ghost lore that flourished across every ocean-going culture of the period. And pirate crews, superstitious by necessity and by trade, were if anything more receptive to it than most, since a life built on genuine unpredictability tends to produce men who look for whatever small patterns of meaning they can find in the chaos. Phantom ships in particular occupied an outsized place in that folklore. Vessels reportedly sighted sailing without visible crew, glowing faintly in fog or moonlight, sometimes said to appear moments before a real, ordinary ship met disaster on the same stretch of water, as though the Phantom had come ahead to scout the coming wreck. New England fishing communities along the Massachusetts coast, in the years following the loss of Samuel Bellamy's Wider Galley in 1717, reportedly told and retold stories of a ghostly vessel or unexplained lights seen near the wreck site off Wellfleet on stormy nights afterward. A piece of local folklore rather than anything resembling documented fact, but a genuinely fitting one, given how many men that particular stretch of sand had already claimed in a single catastrophic night. The most famous phantom ship of all, the Flying Dutchman, doesn't actually enter the written historical record until several decades after the Golden Age of Piracy had already ended. The earliest surviving printed references to the specific legend date to the final years of the 18th century, well after Bellamy and Blackbeard were already dead and buried, or in Blackbeard's case, mounted on a pole. But the raw ingredients of the story: a ship cursed to sail forever without ever reaching port, a captain damned for some act of arrogance or defiance against God or the sea itself, doomed crew members trying and failing to send letters home with any passing vessel willing to take them, drew on a much older and looser body of maritime superstition that absolutely was circulating during the Golden Age, even if this particular name legend, with its particular Dutch captain, hadn't yet crystallized into the specific form later sailors would recognize. It's worth being honest about that timeline, rather than simply folding the famous version backward onto an earlier era it doesn't technically belong to. In the version of the Flying Dutchman legend that eventually did take hold, and which spread rapidly through sailors' oral tradition once it appeared in print, a Dutch merchant captain, sometimes named Hendrik van der Decken in later retellings, though the name varies considerably between versions, which is itself a good indication of how loosely the story travelled by word of mouth before anyone standardized it, attempted to round the treacherous Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa against a violent, seemingly unbeatable storm, refusing every warning from his own crew to turn back. In his arrogance, or in some versions his outright blasphemy, cursing God and the storm itself for standing in his way, he doomed his ship and every soul aboard to sail that same stretch of ocean forever, never able to make port, never able to complete the voyage he'd been so determined to force through by sheer stubborn will. Sailors who claimed to sight the ghostly vessel in the centuries after the legend spread, and reported sightings continued well into the 20th century. Long after any reasonable person stopped taking the literal ghost story seriously, treated the encounter as a genuinely bad omen, a warning that disaster was close at hand for whatever real ship happened to spot the Phantom. It's a story that does a great deal of quiet cultural work beyond simply entertaining frightened sailors on a long watch. A ship that vanished without a trace, as so many genuinely did across the age of sail, lost to storms, to navigational error, to disease, but wiped out an entire crew before anyone ashore even learnt the ship was in trouble. Left behind an unbearable kind of uncertainty for the families and communities who never got an answer about what actually happened. A legend like the Flying Dutchman offered something almost like closure, even a grim and superstitious kind. The missing ship hadn't simply vanished into meaningless silence. It was still out there somewhere, cursed and endlessly sailing, which is a strange sort of a comfort, but a comfort all the same. Not every strange light sailors of this period reported came from the sky at all. Trailing behind almost any ship moving through warm tropical or subtropical water at night was a second, entirely different kind of glow. The faint, cold, blue-green sparkle you might have noticed for yourself. Briefly, watching the Widers wake in an earlier part of tonight's story, or in the water off Nathaniel Cole's own sloop during a calm middle watch, sailors of the era called it, without much elaboration, the sea's fire, and had no more scientific explanation for it than they did for the light at the masthead. Modern marine biology has since identified the actual cause, countless microscopic marine organisms, many of them dinoflagellates, capable of producing their own light through a chemical reaction called bioluminescence. Most commonly triggered by physical disturbance in the water, the churn of a ship's hull cutting through the surface, the movement of a swimming fish, even a hand trailed idly over the rail, all capable of setting off a brief sparkling cascade of cold blue-green light in the disturbed water, where corposant tended to be read as an omen requiring careful interpretation. Good or bad depending on the count and location of the lights, the sea's fire carried a gentler, more consistently wondrous reputation among sailors of the period, less a warning to be decoded, and more simply a source of genuine, uncomplicated beauty on nights that otherwise offered very little of it. Ship's logs from across the era occasionally paused their usual dry recitation of headings and weather to note, almost in spite of themselves, how remarkable the phenomenon looked trailing behind the hull on an especially calm, dark night. A rare moment of pure aesthetic appreciation breaking through the otherwise relentlessly practical business of keeping a wooden ship and her crew alive. More than a century after the Golden Age of Piracy had ended, the phenomenon was still reliable enough and still striking enough to earn a mention from one of the most careful scientific observers in history. In January of 1832, the young naturalist Charles Darwin, aboard Hump's Beagle during the voyage that would eventually shape his life's work, recorded in his own diary a vivid description of corposant playing across the ship's rigging during a violent electrical storm, noting the strange, cold light dancing along the yardarms with the same fascinated, slightly unsettled tone that Pigafetta had used 3 centuries earlier. By Darwin's time, educated observers understood the phenomenon as an electrical, rather than supernatural event, but the description itself, the light, the flicker, the eerie eyewitness sense of something alive at the masthead, had barely changed at all across those 300 intervening years. Whatever name a given century attached to it, the actual experience of standing on a pitching deck and watching a cold blue fire crawl along your own ship's rigging had a strange kind of consistency that neither St. Erasmus nor Benjamin Franklin's electrical theories ever quite managed to fully drain of its wonder. Lightning left behind more than just an eerie glow too, and this particular hazard was one every navigator of the period genuinely feared, for entirely practical rather than superstitious reasons. A close lightning strike could scramble or fully reverse the magnetism of a ship's compass needle, a malfunction sailors of the era sometimes called compass fever, leaving a crew navigating on a needle that pointed confidently and completely wrong. Given that a ship's entire ability to find land, avoid reefs, and rendezvous with the rest of a pirate fleet depended on trusting that needle without question, a compass thrown off by a nearby strike could turn a survived storm into a slower, quieter disaster days later, as a ship confidently sailed itself hundreds of miles off its intended course without anyone aboard realizing anything was wrong until landfall failed to appear where it should have. Not every piece of sky lore a sailor of this era carried around in his head was quite so mysterious, and it's worth pausing on the ones that were, by any modern measure, genuinely useful rather than merely comforting. Red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky at morning. Sailors take warning was already a well-worn rhyme by the time any pirate crew of the Golden Age repeated it, tracing back through English tradition at least as far as the Gospel of Matthew, and it happens to describe something real. In the mid-latitudes where most of this piracy took place, weather systems generally move west to east. And a red sky at sunset typically means high pressure and clear conditions are arriving from the west, while the same red glow at sunrise often means that clear high pressure system has already passed through, and a wetter system is moving in behind it. A high, thin scattering of cloud sailors called mare's tails, and a hazy ring sometimes visible around the moon on an otherwise clear night. Were read the same practical way, both as it happens genuine early signs of an approaching frontal system, long before anyone aboard had access to a proper forecast. Somewhere in among all the omens that had no real predictive power at all, the Jonahs, the unlucky renamed ships, the bananas blamed for disappearances they almost certainly didn't cause, a working sailor's folklore also quietly encoded a fair amount of genuinely accurate, hard-won meteorological observation, passed down exactly the same way as the ghost stories, indistinguishable in tone from the nonsense sitting right alongside it, and just as easy to dismiss along with it if you didn't know which parts to trust. Local folklore along the same stretch of North Carolina coastline where Edward Teach met his end has, over the centuries since, produced its own specific addition to this same tradition. Residents and fishermen around Ocracoke have long told of an eerie, unexplained light sometimes seen flickering over the water near the spot locals still call Teach's Hole, where the fatal battle took place. A glow some versions of the story describe as Blackbeard's own ghost, still searching the shallows, so the tale goes, for the head that Maynard's men carried off to Virginia 300 years ago. It's worth being entirely clear that this is local legend rather than anything approaching documented fact. No different in kind from the ghost stories that grew up around the Wyder's wreck site a few decades earlier, or the countless other phantom light tales attached to shipwreck locations up and down both American coastlines. But it's a fitting piece of folklore all the same, precisely because it does what the very best ghost stories tend to do. It takes a real, documented, genuinely violent historical event and gives it an afterlife in the local imagination that outlasts every dry fact in the official record by a wide margin. Teach's own legend, in other words, didn't stop growing the moment Maynard's blade found its mark. It simply changed shape, the same way it had been changing shape all along, from a real Bristol sailor turned privateer turned pirate, into a beard full of burning fuses, into a corpse supposedly swimming laps around a Royal Navy sloop, and finally into a light on the water that fishermen still occasionally claim to see on a dark night off Ocracoke. 3 centuries after the man himself stopped being able to argue with any of it, none of this was unique to sailors or to the particular stretch of ocean the Golden Age of Piracy played out across. Nearly every culture that has ever lived near dark water or wild, unlit countryside has produced some version of the same basic story, an eerie, unexplained light, wandering or hovering somewhere it shouldn't logically be, tied to death, warning, or misfortune. Welsh folklore told of the corpse candle, a small pale flame said to travel the exact route a funeral procession would soon take, appearing sometimes days before an actual death occurred, as though grief itself had learned to send an advance warning. English and broader European tradition spoke of the will-o'-the-wisp, a flickering light glimpsed over marshland and bog, said to lure lost travellers off solid ground and into the mire by mimicking the warm, welcoming glow of a distant lantern. Modern science attributes at least some of these particular land-based sightings to the spontaneous combustion of marsh gas, methane and phosphine released by decomposing organic matter in wetland environments, a far less poetic, considerably more chemical explanation than anything the original storytellers had available to them, but one that shares an interesting family resemblance with corpuscent, both a real, physically explicable phenomena that got mistaken, for centuries on end, for a message from somewhere else entirely. It is in the end a remarkably consistent piece of human behaviour across wildly different times, places and cultures, this reflexive tendency, standing at the edge of the genuinely unknown, to reach not for a chemistry textbook, but for a story instead, and to trust that story enough to alter behaviour around it, crossing yourself at the masthead, refusing to whistle up a wind, giving a wide berth to a marsh at dusk. Wonder, it turns out, doesn't strictly require an explanation to be genuinely useful. Sometimes the not knowing is doing real work all on its own. There's a reasonable case to be made that all of this folklore, the corposant, the phantom ships, the corpse candles and the Ocracoke light alike, served a genuinely practical purpose for the men who believed in it, whatever its actual scientific accuracy. Nathaniel Cole's own philosophy about superstition, offered to a nervous new recruit a few weeks into his very first voyage, applies just as neatly here as it did to a rule about whistling. A sailor of this era could not control the weather, could not control disease, could not control whether a particular storm turned survivable or catastrophic. What he could control, in some small psychological sense, was his relationship to the unexplained things happening around him, deciding that a light meant something, that it followed rules, that it could be read and interpreted and responded to correctly, rather than simply enduring an indifferent universe with absolutely no handle to grab onto anywhere. A story, even an inaccurate one, is a kind of grip, and men clinging to the rigging of a ship in the dark, 300 miles from the nearest solid ground, have always needed something to hold on to besides the rope itself. That need for a handle on the unexplained didn't only apply to lights and storms and ghosts, either. It applied just as much to the ordinary, deliberate danger of the job these men had actually chosen. The raids, the chases, the boardings that put bread, rum, and a fair share of coin in a pirate crew's pocket in the first place. That's where tonight's story turns next. Away from the sky and the water, and back toward the much more immediate danger of another ship's deck, seen for the first time through the dark, and closing fast. 3 months aboard now, and the cold, wet misery of your first storm watch has settled into something you'd almost call competence, if you were the type to say so out loud in front of Nathaniel Cole. You can read the ship's sounds without thinking about them. You can hold a heading in the dark without a mentor's hand hovering nearby to correct you. And tonight, for the first time since you signed the articles, you've been told to stand ready with the boarding party rather than the pumps or the lookout line, a small, unspoken vote of confidence that means more to you than you expected it to. The cry comes down a little after 10 in the evening, a sail, showing dim running lights, holding a steady course that suggests her crew has no idea anyone's out here watching them at all. This time, unlike a false alarm you remember from your very first week aboard, the shape doesn't dissolve into fog or wishful thinking as the ship closes the distance. It's real, a 2-masted merchant snow, riding low in the water in a way that speaks of a full cargo hold, sailing an unhurried, unsuspecting course that your own captain reads, correctly, as the gait of a ship that has absolutely no reason to expect trouble tonight. You feel your pulse pick up in a way that has nothing to do with fear of a storm this time, and everything to do with the particular electric anticipation of a hunt that's actually going somewhere. The captain's first order isn't to load the guns or beat to whatever passes for quarters on a sloop this size. It's to run up a set of false colours, a merchant flag, English or Dutch depending on what's in the ship's locker and what seems most plausible given the target's apparent home port, hoisted up the halyard in place of anything that would give away your actual intentions. This particular piece of theatre was such standard practice across the entire age of sail, among honest navies and outright pirates alike, that most maritime nations of the period had an informal understanding about it. Flying false colours to close the distance was considered fair play, so long as you ran up your true flag. For a pirate crew, the black or occasionally red flag now generally remembered simply as the Jolly Roger, before actually opening fire or demanding surrender. Fighting under false colours, by contrast, was treated as a genuine war crime by the standards of the day, a distinction that sounds almost quaint given everything else about the profession, but one that pirate crews of this era were, by the surviving record, generally careful to observe. You watch the gap between the two ships narrow from a comfortable half-mile to a few hundred yards, running quiet, most of the crew kept below or crouched low along the rail out of sight, exactly the way Maynard's sailors would keep themselves hidden behind Ocracoke's shallow water some months from now, in a very different kind of engagement you haven't heard the end of yet. The Merchant Snow shows no sign of alarm. Her own lookout, if she's even keeping one properly at this hour, has no particular reason to give a friendly-looking flag a second glance. Beside you at the rail, checking the edge of a cutlass with the calm, unhurried attention of a man checking whether his boots are laced properly, is Isaiah, a topman in his late 20s, quick and sure-footed enough aloft that he's regularly given the most demanding sail-handling work on the ship, and one of several black crewmen serving under this captain's articles as full, equal-sharing members of the company, rather than as anyone's property. Isaiah escaped a rice plantation somewhere along the Carolina coast a little over a year ago, made his way to a small boat, and eventually fell in with this crew in a Bahamas harbour, where he was offered exactly the same choice every other man aboard was offered: sign the articles as an equal, or don't sign at all. He signed. Under a merchant flag or a naval commission, his skin alone would have barred him from ever holding a vote, a weapon, or a share equal to any other sailors. Under this ship's articles, none of that applies, and it's a distinction the pirate life's genuinely rare fairness makes concrete in a way few other paths available to him at the time ever could have. He has a habit, you've noticed, of humming a low, wordless tune under his breath in the moments right before real danger. Not loud enough for anyone but his nearest neighbour to catch. And never once during the boring, uneventful stretches of an ordinary watch, only now, at the sharp edge of something about to happen. You've come to find it oddly steadying rather than distracting, the way some men are calmed by another man's calm rather than needing their own. By the time you're within hailing distance, close enough now to make out individual figures moving on the Merchant Snow's deck, the false flag comes down and the true one goes up in a single practiced motion, and your captain's voice carries clear across the closing water, demanding immediate surrender in exchange for the crew's safety. This is the moment, more than the chase or the boarding itself, that actually decides most nights like this one, the vast majority of merchant crews across the entire Golden Age of Piracy, faced with a clearly superior force and a captain whose reputation, however exaggerated, promises considerably worse treatment for resistance than for cooperation, simply struck their own colours and surrendered without a shot fired. It's a calculation that made sound sense on both sides of the exchange, a merchant crew risking their lives for cargo that belonged to their employer, not to them personally, had very little practical incentive to fight to the death over someone else's goods, and a pirate captain genuinely preferred a bloodless capture, since a fight cost him ammunition, risked his own men, and frequently damaged the very cargo he was hoping to sell intact. Tonight the Merchant Snow's colours come down within a minute of the demand, and you feel something in your own chest unclench that you hadn't fully realised was clenched. No cannon fire. No boarding under fire, no wounded men needing Josiah Pell's grim expertise before the night is through. Just a quiet, tense, entirely one-sided negotiation carried out in the dark between two ships now lying close alongside one another, grappling lines already being thrown to lash the hulls together for what comes next. Going over the side onto an unfamiliar deck in the dark is nothing at all like the drills you practiced back in Nassau Harbour, where the worst that could happen was an embarrassing stumble in front of your own crewmates. Here, even with a peaceful surrender already agreed, adrenaline runs its own separate current through your whole body, entirely indifferent to what your rational mind already knows about tonight's low odds of violence. You go hand over hand along a grappling line with Isaiah just ahead of you, boots, finding unfamiliar planking in the near-total dark, and the merchant crew, a dozen frightened, unarmed men clustered near their own mainmast under the watchful eye of two of your shipmates, stare at you with an expression you recognise uncomfortably well, because you wore roughly the same one yourself, 4 months and a lifetime ago, standing in a tavern deciding whether to sign a set of articles or take your chances below decks in chains. Nathaniel moves among the huddled merchant sailors with the same brisk, business-like competence he brings to everything else aboard your own ship, asking questions in a tone that's firm but genuinely not cruel. Where's the cargo manifest? Where's the captain? Is there anyone aboard who's sick or injured and needs attention before anything else happens? It's a strange kind of courtesy to extend to men you've just forcibly boarded at gunpoint, and yet it's entirely consistent with everything you've learned about how this particular crew actually operates. Violence, when it happens at all, tends to be reserved for genuine resistance, not deployed as casual cruelty against men who've already given up. Below decks, by lantern light, the true shape of the night's prize starts to reveal itself. Barrels of salted provisions, bolts of cloth, a modest strongbox of coin that will need to be properly counted and recorded before any of it can be divided, according to the ship's articles. It is, by the standards of pirate legend, a thoroughly unglamorous haul. No chests of doubloons spilling across the deck, no glittering jewels, just the ordinary practical cargo of an ordinary trading voyage, which is in fact the overwhelming majority of what pirate crews actually took across the entire Golden Age. However much popular imagination since has preferred to picture something considerably more cinematic. Coin, cloth, provisions, tools, sometimes a captured ship's entire crew of skilled specialists more valuable to a pirate captain than anything sitting in the hold. This is what a working pirate economy genuinely looked like on an ordinary night, closer to an armed, illegal customs seizure than a treasure hunt. You're searching a side cabin near the stern when you hear Isaiah's voice change. Not louder exactly, but tighter, more careful, the wordless humming from earlier gone entirely quiet. You follow the sound and find him standing in front of a locked hatch set low in the hull. A hatch that, on this particular class of merchant vessel, you've both seen often enough by now to recognise immediately for what it is. Isaiah breaks the lock with a single hard strike from the flat of an axe, and behind the hatch, in a space with barely enough headroom to sit upright, are 11 men and women, chained at wrist and ankle, blinking against the sudden lantern light with a particular hollow, wary expression of people who have learned, the hard way, that any change in their circumstances usually means something worse is coming, rather than something better. This merchant Snow, beneath its ordinary cargo of cloth and provisions, has been carrying a smaller, secondary human cargo as well, captives being transported for sale further up the coast, chained in a space too cramped and too foul-smelling for you to properly register anything else in the room for several long seconds after the hatch swings open. It would be dishonest, and a genuine disservice to the actual historical record, to pretend that pirate crews of this era uniformly responded to a discovery like this one with liberation and equal welcome. The documented reality across the Golden Age is considerably messier and, in a great many well-recorded cases, simply continued the same brutal trade under a different flag, with captured enslaved people sold onward at the next port, rather than freed at all. What happens next on this particular ship, under this particular captain and quartermaster, is one real and recorded pattern among several that existed, not the universal rule, and it's worth being honest about that rather than letting a single generous knight stand in for the whole ugly picture. Nathaniel is summoned, takes one look at the hold, and goes to fetch the captain himself, rather than making this particular call alone, a decision serious enough on a ship governed by voted articles that it genuinely warrants the full weight of command rather than a quartermaster's individual judgment. What follows is not a speech, not a dramatic proclamation of principle. It's a practical offer, delivered plainly by your captain standing in the cramped foul air of the hold. Any of the captives willing to sign the ship's articles as full and equal members of the crew, with the same vote, the same share, and the same protections as any other man aboard, are free to do so, right now, and to leave this hold behind for good. Anyone unwilling or unable will be put ashore at the nearest safe landing your crew can manage, rather than sold onward or kept in the same chains that brought them here. Isaiah translates part of this into a language he half remembers from his own childhood, for the benefit of a woman near the back of the hold who clearly hasn't understood a word of English spoken so far tonight, and something in his voice as he does it makes clear this isn't a routine task for him. He crouches down to her eye level rather than standing over her, and waits, without rushing her, for an answer. 6 of the 11 choose to sign, right there in the hold, their chains struck off by the ship's own carpenter before the ink on the articles is even dry. The other 5, an older man who says, through Isaiah's halting translation, that he has family waiting at the port this ship was originally bound for, and 4 others who simply want solid ground and no more ships of any kind for the foreseeable future, are promised passage to the nearest safe landing instead, a promise your captain to his credit. Actually keeps 2 days later, rather than conveniently forgetting it once the excitement of the raid has faded. It's Isaiah who stays longest in the hold after the decision is made, helping the newly freed men and women up into lantern light and fresher air one at a time, offering a hand, a name, a few words of clumsy reassurance in whatever fragments of language he can manage. You watch him with one of the 6 new recruits, a broad-shouldered man perhaps 10 years older than Isaiah himself, still rubbing raw wrists where the iron sat too long, and catch the exact moment something passes between them that has nothing to do with articles or shares or votes. Recognition maybe, or simply the specific, wordless relief of one formerly chained man watching another one walk free. Isaiah doesn't hum his usual tune tonight. He doesn't need to. Whatever steadies him in the moment before danger apparently isn't required in the moment after real hope arrives instead. The Merchant Snow's own captain, a stout, red-faced man who gives his name only reluctantly as Josiah Fenwick, proves considerably less cooperative than his crew once he realizes exactly how much of his cargo Manifest Your Quartermaster already seems to know about. He claims, with the particular strained dignity of a man trying to bluff his way through a situation he has no real leverage in, that the strongbox in his cabin holds nothing but ship's papers and a little personal correspondence, a claim that lasts exactly as long as it takes Nathaniel to actually open it and find, beneath a thin layer of letters, a second false bottom concealing roughly £200 sterling in coin that Fenwick had clearly hoped to quietly preserve for himself rather than declare as part of his. Employer's cargo. Nathaniel says nothing especially dramatic about the deception, simply counts the coin out loud for the benefit of anyone within earshot and adds it to the night's official tally, and Fenwick's face goes from red to a colour you don't have a good word for. Happens on every 3rd ship or so, Nathaniel tells you afterward, with the weary amusement of a man who has personally uncovered a great many false-bottomed strongboxes in his career. Captains skimming their own employer's cargo, hoping the pirates take the blame for the shortfall when he gets back to port. We just save him the trouble of explaining it away later. It's a strange, almost sympathetic footnote to an otherwise straightforward raid. The realization that the honest-looking merchant captain protesting his own innocence loudest was, in his own quiet way, robbing someone too, just with considerably less honesty about it than the crew currently searching his cabin. Fenwick, for his part, spends the rest of the encounter conspicuously silent, watching his own hidden coin get folded into someone else's tally with the particular sour expression of a man who has just been caught doing exactly what he accused the pirates, in advance, of intending to do to him. Once the hold has been thoroughly searched and the newly freed men and women brought up into the lantern light, the actual mechanics of dividing tonight's prize begin in earnest, and it's a considerably less romantic process than popular imagination tends to picture. Nathaniel works by lantern with a slate and chalk, tallying the coin, valuing the cloth and provisions as best he can estimate against what they'll likely fetch when sold ashore, and setting aside the fixed portion owed to the ship itself for repairs and provisions before a single man's individual share gets calculated at all. Under this crew's articles, the captain and quartermaster each draw a modestly larger share in recognition of their added responsibility. Gunners and the ship's few skilled specialists draw a share and a quarter, and every ordinary hand, yourself included, draws a single full share apiece, a formula that, whatever its imperfections, puts considerably less distance between the captain's pocket and an ordinary sailor's than any merchant or naval vessel of the period would ever have tolerated. It's paperwork, essentially, conducted at 4 a.m. by lantern light on a captured ship's deck, and it is, in its own unglamorous way, exactly as important to how this crew survives as any cutlass or grappling hook. By the time the last of the prize's cargo has been transferred across to your own ship's hold, and the merchant crew, minus the 11 from below, plus 6 new names now entered onto your own crew's articles, has been left to sail on toward whatever port they were originally bound for, the eastern sky is already threatening the first grey edge of dawn. Nathaniel completes his tally of the night's take by lantern light, coin, cloth, provisions, and 6 new hands, each one entitled from this moment forward to exactly the same vote and exactly the same share as a man who's sailed under this flag for years. It's not the kind of prize the taverns back in Nassau like to sing about. There's no single dazzling number to boast of, no chest of jewels to spread out on the deck and admire. But watching 6 formerly chained men eat a hot meal on the deck of a free ship as the sun comes up, you find yourself thinking that this particular haul might genuinely be the richest one this crew has taken all year, by a measure the ship's articles were never actually designed to count. Not every night at sea ends with the pirates as the ones doing the capturing, though. For every raid that goes as smoothly as this one has, there's a night somewhere else on the calendar when the balance of power tips the other way entirely, and the hunters aboard a pirate sloop find themselves, with very little warning, become the hunted instead. The story that follows is exactly that kind of reversal. A night when a very different pirate crew, defended by 2 of the most famous women in the entire Golden Age, found the tables turned against them off the coast of Jamaica, in a fight considerably less tidy than the one you've just walked away from. Just before dawn on the night of October 22nd, 1720, in a small cove near Negril Point on the western tip of Jamaica, a sloop under commission from the island's governor closes silently on an anchored pirate vessel whose crew, by nearly every surviving account of that night, is in no fit state to defend itself. Most of the men aboard are reportedly too drunk to properly rise, let alone fight, and as the attacking sloop's crew swarms aboard, it is not the ship's captain who mounts the fiercest resistance. It is 2 of his crew, cutlasses in hand, fighting with a ferocity that the boarding party's own testimony afterward singles out above every other man on that deck, and both of them, as the captured crew is marched below to be sorted for trial, turn out to be women. This is the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 2 of the only women confirmed by name and documented court record to have sailed openly as pirates during the entire Golden Age of Piracy, and the strange, largely improvised path that carried each of them, from wildly different starting points on opposite sides of the Atlantic, onto the same small stolen sloop off the coast of Jamaica on the one night their luck finally ran out. Anne Bonny's story begins in County Cork, Ireland, where she was born sometime around 1697 or 1698, reportedly the illegitimate daughter of a practicing attorney named William Cormac and a household servant, a scandal serious enough by the standards of the day. That Cormac eventually relocated the family across the Atlantic to Charleston, in the colony of South Carolina, where he rebuilt a successful legal and plantation career and raised his daughter in considerably more comfort than her origins might have predicted. Surviving accounts, again largely filtered through Johnson's general history, and therefore worth treating with appropriate caution on the finer details, describe young Anne as headstrong and quick-tempered even by the standards of her father's household, a reputation that only grew once she married, against her father's wishes, a small-time sailor and sometime pirate informant named James Bonny, a match that reportedly cost her any hope of inheriting her father's considerable estate. The marriage carried the couple to Nassau, in the Bahamas, sometime around 1718 or 1719, precisely the same lawless pirate haven that had, only a couple of years earlier, produced Benjamin Hornigold's crew, and from it, both Samuel Bellamy and Edward Teach. By the time Anne Bonny arrived there, Nassau's brief golden window as an unpoliced pirate republic was already closing, as the newly appointed royal governor, Woodes Rogers, worked to reassert crown authority over the island and its unruly population. It was in this same narrowing window that Anne reportedly met and became involved with a pirate captain named John Rackham, more commonly remembered by his nickname Calico Jack on account of the brightly patterned cotton clothing he was said to favour, and by most accounts it was Anne who left her husband for Rackham rather than the reverse, an unusually assertive piece of agency for a woman of her era to exercise, and one the surviving record treats with a certain amount of scandalized fascination even 3 centuries later. Mary Read's path to that same anchored sloop off Jamaica began even more unusually, and considerably further away, in London, likely in the early 1690s. According to Johnson's account, again folklore adjacent in its specifics, though the broad shape of the story is corroborated by later trial testimony, Mary's mother, widowed and left with little income, had already lost a legitimate infant son before Mary was born out of a subsequent relationship. To continue collecting financial support from her late husband's family, who believed the boy was still alive, Mary's mother reportedly dressed her surviving daughter as a boy from a very young age and presented her to the family under her dead half-brother's identity, a deception that, remarkably, appears to have simply continued as ordinary practice through the rest of Mary's childhood, until disguise as a boy had become less a temporary ruse than the only way of moving through the world she had ever really known. That upbringing carried directly into adulthood. Mary reportedly served for a time as a soldier in Flanders, fighting in a cavalry regiment during one of the long wars between Britain, France, and their various allies in the early 18th century, still presenting as a man throughout her military service. According to the same account, she eventually fell in love with a fellow soldier in her unit, revealed her identity to him privately, and the two married once the immediate danger of active campaigning had passed, a marriage that tragically ended in widowhood within a few years when her husband died, leaving Mary once again to make her own way, this time by returning to the sea, initially aboard an ordinary merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean, dressed once more as a man out of practical necessity rather than any lingering deception. Mary's merchant voyage across the Atlantic ended the same way a great many merchant voyages of this era did, captured by pirates, somewhere in Caribbean waters, on a date the surviving record doesn't pin down with any real precision. According to surviving accounts, the specific crew that took her ship was, by one telling, associated with the same broad Nassau pirate confederation that had already produced Hornigold, Bellamy and Teach, and Mary, like a great many captured sailors before her, chose to sign on rather than face an uncertain fate as a prisoner. She continued presenting as a man throughout this period, apparently without her shipmates realizing otherwise, which speaks either to a genuinely convincing disguise sustained across years of close shipboard living, or to a crew simply uninterested in scrutinizing the matter too closely so long as the sailor in question pulled her weight, likely in truth, some combination of both, and a testament besides to just how little formal documentation or scrutiny an ordinary pirate recruit actually faced once he, or in this case she, had signed the articles and taken up a place at the oars or the rigging alongside everyone else. By the time both Rackham's pardon at Nassau proved short-lived and he returned to open piracy sometime in 1720, both Anne Bonny and Mary Read were aboard his small stolen sloop, the William, itself taken from Nassau Harbour in a nighttime raid rather than legitimately acquired. A detail that gives the whole crew's later downfall a certain ironic symmetry, captured eventually the same way they'd captured their own ship in the first place. Court testimony collected after their arrest confirms that both women dressed in men's clothing during actual combat, reserving women's clothing for quieter moments aboard ship, and that at least some of their male crewmates were fully aware of their true identities well before the final battle that ended the voyage. The documented reputation both women earned aboard Rackham's crew is worth pausing on, because it complicates any easy assumption about what their presence aboard actually meant to the men sailing with them. Trial testimony from captured witnesses describes both Bonny and Read as active, willing participants in boarding actions and combat, dressed as men armed with pistols and cutlasses, and by more than one account genuinely more aggressive in a fight than several of their male crewmates. One deposition specifically describes Read cursing and threatening a captured prisoner who displeased her, in language the court reporter apparently found too coarse to transcribe in full. Neither woman appears in the surviving record as a passenger tolerated aboard a pirate ship, or as a curiosity kept for some other purpose. Both are described consistently as working pirates, doing the same violent, dangerous job as every other member of the crew, and by several accounts doing it with more evident commitment than most. It's worth noting too that pirate crews of this era were not unique in occasionally including women who passed as men. The broader 18th century record includes a handful of other documented cases of women serving in various disguised military and maritime roles across Europe and its colonies. What made Bonny and Reed's case so widely remembered wasn't merely that they existed, but that their identities became public through a sensational criminal trial, preserved in exactly the kind of official court record that so much of the rest of this era's history depends on second-hand legend to fill in. By the autumn of 1720, Jamaica's colonial governor Nicholas Laws had grown sufficiently alarmed by Rackham's continued raiding along the island's coastline to commission a privateer named Jonathan Barnett, an experienced Jamaican sea captain. With explicit orders to hunt the crew down, Barnett was, by the standards of the profession, exactly the kind of man such a commission required, a working mariner with his own armed sloop and crew, operating under a legal privateering commission that made hunting pirates both profitable and entirely lawful. A mirror image in some ways of the very career path several of the men he was chasing had themselves abandoned in favour of piracy. He had spent weeks working the coastline west of Kingston on intelligence and rumour, the same slow, patient process of tracking a moving target through a landscape of small coves and hidden anchorages that any pirate hunter of the period had to master, since no single governor's navy could realistically patrol every mile of Caribbean coastline at once. Barnett located Rackham's sloop at anchor in a small bay near Negril Point on the night of October 22nd, 1720, apparently taking advantage of exactly the kind of relaxed, celebratory evening that a successful pirate crew, flush with a recent haul and confident in the isolation of their anchorage, might reasonably let themselves enjoy. According to the testimony collected afterward, rum was flowing freely aboard the William that evening, and by the time Barnett's sloop closed on their position in the dark, a significant portion of Rackham's crew was in no condition to mount any kind of organised defence at all. What happened next is preserved specifically because it became central testimony at the subsequent piracy trial, as Barnett's men swarmed aboard in the confusion of a nighttime boarding action. Most of Rackham's crew reportedly retreated below decks rather than fight, whether out of drunkenness, fear, or simple hopeless recognition that the fight was already lost. Anne Bonny and Mary Reed did not retreat. According to multiple witness accounts given under oath, the two women stood their ground on deck, fighting with cutlasses and pistols against Barnett's boarding party, and at least one account describes one of the women firing a pistol down into the hold at their own crewmates in a furious attempt to force the hiding men back up to help defend the ship. A detail almost too vivid to be entirely invented, though it comes to us, as so much of this era does, through testimony rather than an independently verified record. Overwhelmed by superior numbers, the entire crew of the William was eventually taken, and Rackham, along with his surviving men and the two women, was brought to Jamaica to stand trial. The proceedings moved quickly by modern standards. Rackham and the majority of his male crew were convicted of piracy and sentenced to hang within days of their capture, the sentence carried out on November 18th. 1720, at a site in Port Royal still remembered locally as Gallows Point, their bodies afterward gibbeted along the harbour as a warning to other sailors passing in and out of the port. Precisely the same grim theatre of deterrence that would greet Blackbeard's own severed head at the mouth of the Hampton River almost exactly 2 years later. Popular legend holds that Anne Bonny was permitted a final visit to Rackham before his execution, and used the occasion to tell him, with considerable bitterness, that she was sorry to see him die, but that if he had fought like a man, he needn't have died at all. It's a devastating line, and an entirely plausible sentiment given everything the trial testimony suggests about how the two women actually behaved that night compared to their captain, but it comes down to us solely through Johnson's general history, without independent corroboration, and belongs, like so much of this story's most memorable dialogue, in the category of vivid legend rather than settled fact. Bonny and Reed's own trial took place separately from Rackham's on November 28, 1720, 10 days after their captain and most of their male crewmates had already hanged at Gallows Point. The surviving trial record from the Jamaican Vice Admiralty Court lists both women by name alongside the specific charges against them: piracy on the high seas, the taking of several named vessels, and armed resistance against Barnett's boarding party, and notes their formal plea, entered once sentence had been passed, that each was quick with child, the period's legal phrase for confirmed pregnancy. The court, per standard practice for this particular defence, ordered a physical examination by local matrons to confirm the claim before granting the stay of execution, a procedure that must have been, whatever else it accomplished, a final and thoroughly undignified indignity layered on top of an already dire situation for two women who had, only weeks earlier, been standing on their own deck with cutlasses in hand. Bonny and Reed were tried separately, and both were convicted of piracy alongside their male crewmates. Both at sentencing invoked the same legal defence. They informed the court that they were pregnant, a claim colonial law of the period took seriously enough, given the shared assumption that an unborn child shouldn't be executed alongside its convicted mother, to grant an automatic stay of execution pending confirmation. This particular legal manoeuvre, referred to informally in the period as pleading one's belly, was neither unique to Bonny and Reed nor an obvious guarantee of eventual freedom. It simply delayed the sentence rather than overturning it, leaving both women's ultimate fate genuinely uncertain in the months that followed their trial. For Mary Reed, that uncertainty resolved itself in the worst possible way, though not by the hangman's rope. According to surviving Jamaican parish burial records, genuine documentary evidence rather than legend, one of the very few hard facts anchoring the end of her story, Mary Reed died in prison in April of 1721, apparently of a fever contracted while awaiting the resolution of her case, and was buried on April 28th of that year in the parish of St. Catherine, Jamaica. The specific nature of the fever isn't recorded in any detail that survives, though prison conditions of the period, combined with the physical toll of pregnancy, would have left her considerably more vulnerable to exactly the kind of infectious illness that claimed so many lives across the entire Golden Age, on ships and in prison cells alike. Anne Bonny's fate, by contrast, simply vanishes from the documented record after her trial, and this is one of those genuinely rare cases where the historical uncertainty deserves to be stated plainly, rather than papered over with a confident-sounding guess. No surviving Jamaican record confirms her execution, her release, or her death in custody. The popular legend that grew up to fill that silence, that her wealthy father, William Cormack, used his considerable legal and financial influence to arrange a quiet release, and that Anne eventually returned to South Carolina, remarried, raised a large family, and lived to a genuinely old age, dying sometime in her 80s in the 1780s, is a satisfying story, and one that a great many popular histories repeat as though it were settled fact. It is not. It's a plausible piece of folklore built to answer a question the actual archive simply never answers, and the honest version of this story has to sit with that uncertainty rather than resolve it neatly, however unsatisfying that leaves the ending. It's worth circling back, here at the end, to a small superstition mentioned in passing many hours ago in this same story, the old sailor's belief that a woman aboard a ship invited misfortune, whistled up storms, or otherwise disrupted whatever fragile order held a crew together across a long voyage. Nathaniel Cole, quietly enforcing that same superstition against an unlucky whistle on a much smaller, much less famous ship, would likely never have crossed paths with either Anne Bonny or Mary Reed, and there's no evidence either woman would have had much patience for that particular rule regardless. The documented record of their time aboard Rackham's crew doesn't describe a ship plagued by unusual misfortune because of their presence. It describes, if anything, a crew that survived considerably longer under their fighting spirit than it likely would have without it, right up until the one-night drink and overconfidence undid what courage alone couldn't fix. Superstition, as it turns out, rarely survives close contact with an inconvenient fact, and Bonny and Reed remain two of the most inconvenient facts the old rule about women at sea ever had to contend with. Their story has, since that trial in 1720, taken on a life almost entirely separate from the court record that actually preserves it. Retold, reimagined, and steadily embellished across 3 centuries of plays, novels, and popular histories, until the documented Anne Bonny and Mary Read became nearly as obscured by legend as Blackbeard's own smoking beard had made him. It's the same pattern this whole night's journey keeps circling back to, ship after ship, captain after captain, a kernel of genuinely remarkable, well-documented fact, wrapped almost immediately in a thicker layer of story that later generations find considerably easier to remember and repeat. The difference in this particular case is that the underlying fact needs no embellishment whatsoever to remain remarkable on its own. 2 women stood their ground on a pirate sloop's deck while most of the men around them fled below. The court recorded it under oath. That part was never legend at all. It is in the end a fitting note to end this particular story on, not the embellishment, not the ribbon tied around it by 3 centuries of retelling, but the plain, sworn testimony of the men who boarded that ship and found the fight considerably harder than they expected, coming from exactly the 2 people they least expected to offer it. What is not in dispute, and what makes both women's stories worth telling honestly rather than merely romantically, is the documented fact of what they actually did aboard that sloop on the night it mattered most. 2 women, in an era that offered them essentially no legitimate path to the kind of freedom, danger, and equal standing a set of pirate articles could offer, chose that path anyway, disguised themselves well enough to sustain it for months or years, and when the moment of real crisis finally arrived off the coast of Jamaica, stood their ground on a deck that most of their male crewmates had already abandoned. Whatever else remains uncertain about where their lives began or ended, that single well-documented fact isn't folklore. It's simply what the record shows. There's a strange comfort somehow in reaching the end of a night like this one and realizing how many different nights it actually contained. A green recruit learning to read a compass by candlelight, and a quartermaster named Nathaniel Cole quietly covering for him rather than reporting him. A galley slave ship, renamed and rearmed. Breaking apart on a Cape Cod sandbar, with 4.5 tons of gold going down alongside a boy who chose that fate for himself rather than stay safely ashore. A bearded man who built an entire reputation out of smoke and fuses, and who turned out, when the record was finally checked, to have needed almost none of the violence everyone assumed defined him. A surgeon's lantern moving down a row of hammocks in the dark, and a fever that broke instead of winning. 2 women who stood their ground on a deck that most of the men around them had already abandoned, and whose courage the court recorded under oath long before anyone thought to turn it into legend. All of it happened at night, in one form or another, on wooden ships that no longer exist, crewed by men and women who have been gone for 300 years now. And all of it still happened, not as smoke and story alone, but as documented, sworn, physically excavated fact, sitting quietly in archives and museum cases and church burial records, waiting for anyone curious enough to go looking. You, right now, are not standing a middle watch in the cold. Nobody is waking you at midnight to take the helm. There's no fever to break, no storm to reef sail against, no boarding party waiting for your signal. You're warm, you're dry, you're safe, in a bed that isn't swinging with anything more dramatic than your own breathing. Somewhere out past all of that history, the ocean is still doing exactly what it's always done. Indifferent and enormous and unbothered by how long ago any of these particular ships went quiet. But you don't have to listen to it tonight. You can simply rest. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.